The morning of the interview that would change my entire life, my mother blocked the front door with her body. She crossed her arms and told me my sister had a bottomless brunch to attend with her friends. She said I was staying home to watch my niece and nephew. When I pleaded that this job interview was my only way out of a minimum wage, my father just laughed from his leather recliner. He told me that girls like me do not get lives, we get duties. My sister walked down the stairs, completely ignoring my tears, and dropped a heavy diaper bag right onto my bare feet. I did not cry or scream. I simply stepped over the bag, walked out the back door, and never returned. 8 years passed before they summoned me back. I am Simone, 33 years old, and today I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Financial Analytics. My family had absolutely no idea I built a corporate empire from the ground up. They just thought I was finally ready to be their doormat again. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family to build your own success. I was sitting in the back of my chauffeur-driven SUV reviewing the final legal terms of a massive corporate merger. The leather seats were perfectly quiet, the city lights of Chicago blurring past the tinted windows as my team prepared for our biggest acquisition yet. My phone buzzed on the center console. It was a text message from Patricia, the woman I used to call Mom. "Family dinner tonight at Le Petit." The message read, "Your sister Brittany is getting a massive promotion because her retail company is being bought out by a major tech firm. Bring your checkbook. It is time you paid us back for skipping out on your family 8 years ago." My chief financial officer was sitting across from me in the SUV. He glanced at the glowing screen and advised me to ignore the message. We had a multi-million-dollar acquisition to finalize that very evening, and he knew my family history. But looking at those demanding words, I felt the phantom weight of that diaper bag hitting my feet 8 years ago. The sheer audacity of them demanding my money after giving me absolutely nothing but grief sparked a familiar fire in my chest. I thought about how Patricia and Richard had funded Brittany through college and paid for her lavish wedding while I was forced to work night shifts just to buy used textbooks. I told my driver to reroute the car to Le Petit. I walked into the high-end French restaurant wearing a plain beige trench coat. I deliberately pulled the long sleeve of my cashmere sweater down to conceal the $80,000 Patek Philippe watch resting on my wrist. I wanted to let them think I was still the struggling, desperate girl they had tried to break all those years ago. The maitre d' led me through the dining room to a private VIP area in the back. My family was already there, being incredibly loud and taking up entirely too much space. Brittany was wearing a flashy designer dress that screamed new money and poor taste. Beside her sat her husband Malik. He was a tall, handsome African-American man, dressed in a velvet dinner jacket, but his entire personality revolved around pretending to be a wealthy investor. As I walked in, he was loudly boasting to the waiter about his crypto portfolio and guaranteed digital yields. My parents, Patricia and Richard, were beaming at them from across the table like they were absolute royalty. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the far end of the long table. The conversation stopped immediately. No one stood up to hug me. No one asked how my health was or where I had been living for the better part of a decade. They just stared at me with the exact same disdain they had always shown. Patricia looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my plain trench coat with obvious disappointment. She muttered something under her breath about how I still did not know how to dress for a nice occasion. I kept my face entirely neutral, waiting for the real reason they had demanded my presence. Before the waiter could even step forward to pour my ice water, Richard reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers and tossed it across the white linen tablecloth. The heavy packet slid to a halt right in front of my empty dinner plate. I glanced down at the bold black letters on the first page. It was a commercial loan guarantor document for exactly $150,000. "Sign it right now," Richard commanded, not even bothering to look me in the eye or offer a greeting. "Malik has all his investments temporarily tied up in digital assets, and Brittany needs to host a lavish networking party for her new corporate overlords at Lux Retail to secure her new vice president title. We agreed you are going to co-sign this loan to float them the cash. It is time you finally paid this family back for the roof we put over your head and the food you ate growing up. I stared at the thick stack of legal papers sitting next to my empty plate. The sheer entitlement radiating from my father was almost suffocating. But before I could even formulate a response, Malik leaned back in his chair and aggressively swirled his whiskey. He shot me a condescending smile that made my skin crawl. He adjusted his velvet jacket and loudly announced that his crypto investments were currently yielding a guaranteed 20% return. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who watched 2 online tutorials and suddenly believed he was a Wall Street hedge fund manager. He claimed his assets were locked in a high-yield digital vault for the next quarter. He actually had the nerve to tell me that letting me co-sign his loan was a massive favor. He said it would help build my non-existent credit score. Right on cue, Brittany thrust her left hand across the table, making sure the restaurant's crystal chandeliers caught the light of her massive new diamond ring. It was a gaudy, ostentatious stone that screamed desperation. She dramatically sighed and complained about how exhausted she was from her grueling corporate schedule at Lux Retail. She bragged that her company was days away from finalizing a buyout by a massive tech conglomerate. She needed this $150,000 loan to throw an elite networking gala. She insisted that hosting this lavish party was the only way to guarantee the mysterious new CEO would hand her the senior vice president title she so clearly deserved. I looked at the diamond ring. I looked at Malik's smug face. Then I looked at the loan guarantor document. I placed my index finger on the thick packet and slowly pushed it right back across the white linen tablecloth. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice barely above a whisper but hard as concrete. The table went entirely silent. The smug smiles vanished from Brittany and Malik's faces. My father's jaw tightened, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. Patricia slammed her wineglass down so hard the stem nearly snapped. "You ungrateful little brat," Patricia hissed, leaning across the table with venom in her eyes. "We gave you everything and you abandoned this family. If you do not pick up that pen and sign your name right now, I will pick up my phone and call the police. I will tell them exactly who stole your grandmother's vintage emerald brooch 8 years ago. We let it slide back then because you were family, but I have no problem pressing grand larceny charges against you today." The air in my lungs turned to ice, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. The sheer audacity of her threat brought a rush of bitter memories flooding back to my mind. I remembered tearing my childhood bedroom apart, desperately searching for that heirloom brooch. I remembered the exact moment Patricia miraculously found it hidden at the bottom of my laundry hamper. I also remembered what happened the very next morning. My parents used that manufactured theft as the perfect excuse to legally drain my entire college savings account. They emptied the fund I had worked for years to build and used every single penny to pay for Brittany's extravagant destination wedding in Cabo. They framed me, robbed me blind, and played the victims. They still thought I was that terrified, helpless 20-something girl who would easily crumble under their psychological warfare. They thought the threat of police involvement would make me beg for their mercy. Instead of panicking, I raised my hand and calmly signaled the waiter. The young man rushed over in a crisp white shirt holding a silver tray with a leather billfold. The timing was impeccable. He awkwardly glanced at the tense faces around the table before placing the bill down. My father immediately pointed a rigid finger at me. "Give the check to her." Richard barked at the waiter. "Since she wants to act so high and mighty and refuse to help her own sister, she can pay for the dinner." I pulled the leather folder toward me and glanced at the receipt. $3,200. They had ordered vintage champagne, imported truffles, and prime steaks before I even walked through the front door. They fully intended to ambush me with the loan and saddle me with the dinner bill. Patricia crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk returning to her lips. She fully expected me to burst into tears. She expected me to admit I could never afford a $3,000 dinner on a minimum wage salary. She expected me to surrender. I reached into the deep pocket of my plain trench coat. I bypassed my standard corporate cards and pulled out a solid titanium American Express Centurion black card. I placed it onto the silver tray. The heavy metal made a distinct, sharp clink that echoed over the soft jazz playing in the restaurant. The waiter's eyes widened. He quickly bowed his head, took the tray, and rushed toward the payment terminal. My family sat completely paralyzed. Patricia's triumphant smirk dissolved into a mask of pure confusion. She stared at the empty space where the heavy black card had just been. Malik sat up straight, his eyes darting frantically toward the waiter's station. Brittany looked at my coat, trying to comprehend how the sister she viewed as absolute trash could possess an invite-only credit card reserved for the ultra-wealthy. "Where did you get that?" Patricia stammered, her voice shaking with a mix of shock and accusation. "Who did you steal that from? Are you dating some old man? Are you involved in something illegal?" I ignored her frantic questions completely. I did not owe them a single word of explanation about my life, my wealth, or the financial empire I had spent the last 8 years building from the ground up. I waited in perfect, suffocating silence until the waiter returned. He handed me the receipt. I signed my name with a steady hand, added a massive tip for his trouble, and stood up from my chair. I slowly buttoned my trench coat, adjusting the collar with meticulous care. I began to walk toward the exit, but as I passed behind Malik's chair, I stopped. I leaned down, bringing my face right next to his ear so that every single person at the table could hear exactly what I was about to say. "You are not tied up in high-yield crypto, Malik," I said, keeping my tone entirely conversational. "You have been funneling borrowed money into leveraged digital assets, and the market just tanked. You are facing a massive margin call from Apex Trading. You owe them over $2 million, and your grace period ends exactly 48 hours from now. If you do not wire the funds by Friday afternoon, they are going to legally seize your house, your cars, and every asset attached to your name." The color instantly drained from Malik's face. He turned a sickly shade of ash gray, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He could not speak. He could not defend himself. He was absolutely paralyzed by the fact that I knew his deepest, darkest financial secret. Brittany looked at her husband in absolute horror, her gaudy diamond ring suddenly feeling like a very heavy anchor. Patricia and Richard sat frozen in their chairs, the illusion of their perfect, successful son-in-law shattering into a million pieces right in front of their eyes. I stood up straight, smoothed the front of my coat, and walked out the front doors of the restaurant without looking back. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung shut behind me, completely cutting off the suffocating air of my family and their manufactured reality. I stepped into the crisp Chicago night and breathed a massive sigh of relief. My driver Thomas was already waiting by the open door of my sleek black SUV. I slid into the quiet sanctuary of the leather back seat, feeling the sharp adrenaline of the confrontation slowly fade into pure calculated focus. For 8 long years, I had prepared for that exact moment. I knew Malik was a total fraud the second I ran a corporate background check on him months ago. Apex Trading was one of my firm's minor subsidiaries. I literally owned his debt. As the car pulled away from the curb and merged into the city traffic, I opened my laptop and went right back to finalizing my latest corporate acquisition. I assumed my parting words would keep my family paralyzed with fear for at least a few days, while Malik scrambled to save his non-existent empire. I severely underestimated Brittany's capacity for petty blind rage. I found out later exactly how the rest of their evening played out. Instead of turning to her husband and demanding to know why he was secretly millions of dollars in debt, Brittany immediately spun a chaotic narrative to protect her fragile ego. She convinced my parents that I was completely delusional. She told Patricia that my titanium credit card was either a highly convincing fake or belonged to some ancient wealthy sugar daddy who was keeping me as a glorified pet to pay for my clothes. In Brittany's mind, there was absolutely no way the sister she had bullied, mocked, and discarded could actually be successful on her own merit. To her, I was still the pathetic girl in the oversized hand-me-down clothes who could be pushed around and forced into submission. Enraged by the public embarrassment I had caused her perfect husband in a five-star restaurant, Brittany decided she needed to put me back in my proper place. She decided the ultimate revenge would be destroying whatever pathetic little job I had managed to scrape together in the city. Brittany marched into her plush corporate office at Lux Retail the very next morning with a singular, vindictive mission. She used her high-level corporate networking tools and scoured the internet until she found a dormant profile connected to my name. It listed Aegis Financial Analytics as my current employer. Because I highly valued my privacy and security, my public profile deliberately obscured my actual title as founder and CEO. It simply listed me as a financial associate. Brittany took the bait instantly. Assuming Aegis was just some mundane mid-level accounting firm and that I was nothing more than an expendable low-level assistant, she picked up her desk phone and dialed my company's main human resources hotline. She put on her most authoritative, condescending vice president of marketing voice and demanded to speak with the head of the department. When she was routed to a secure voicemail box, she left a staggering 5-minute recording detailing a completely fabricated history of my supposed crimes. I was sitting in my corner office on the 40th floor reviewing the quarterly profit margins while sipping a black coffee. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, serving as a daily reminder of the empire I had built entirely with my own two hands. A gentle knock on the thick frosted glass door broke my concentration. It was Marcus, my vice president of human resources. He was a ruthless, brilliant former corporate litigator who rarely cracked a smile, but today he walked into my suite looking like he was actively struggling to contain absolute hysterics. He held his tablet securely in one hand and closed the door behind him to ensure total privacy. He walked over to my massive mahogany desk and asked if I happened to have an older sister named Brittany. I felt my posture stiffen instantly. I placed my coffee cup down and asked him exactly why he wanted to know. Marcus set his tablets on my desk and explained that a very distressed woman claiming to be an executive at Lux Retail had just left a highly urgent, highly threatening voicemail on the external HR intake line. He pressed play. Brittany's shrill, frantic voice instantly filled my executive suite. She introduced herself with her full corporate title, making sure to emphasize exactly how important she was in the retail sector. Then the lies started flowing like absolute venom. She told my HR department that it was her moral and professional duty to warn them about a severe liability currently hiding in their ranks. She claimed I was a notorious kleptomaniac who had stolen tens of thousands of dollars from my own parents to fund a gambling addiction. She told them I had a documented history of severe mental instability and violent outbursts in previous workplaces. She warned them that if they gave me access to any sensitive financial data or company credit cards, I would absolutely embezzle corporate funds to support my reckless, fraudulent lifestyle. She finished the recording by demanding they terminate my employment immediately, insisting that keeping a dangerous, toxic element like me on the payroll would undoubtedly result in a massive corporate lawsuit that would destroy their firm. The recording clicked off. The silence in my massive office was absolutely deafening. Marcus looked at me completely bewildered by the sheer audacity of the phone call. He asked if I wanted our aggressive legal department to draft a cease and desist order for defamation slander and corporate harassment. He was entirely ready to bury my sister in endless litigation before she even went to lunch. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below, feeling a cold, genuine smile slowly spread across my face. I shook my head and told Marcus to stand down his lawyers. I did not want to get mad. I wanted to let them dig their own graves. I looked back at my vice president of human resources and gave him a direct, unyielding order. I told him to draft a highly official corporate email on Aegis letterhead and send it directly to Brittany's work address at Lux Retail. I instructed him to thank her profusely for her outstanding corporate citizenship and her remarkable bravery in coming forward with such vital information. Then I told him to write one final definitive sentence, confirming that after a rapid internal review, the employee known as Simone has been successfully and permanently terminated effective immediately. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but nodded sharply, understanding exactly what kind of psychological warfare I was engaging in. I told him to let my sister pop the expensive champagne and celebrate her imaginary victory today because she had absolutely no idea what kind of hell I was bringing to her doorstep tomorrow. It was early Saturday morning when the fallout from Marcus sending that termination email finally arrived at my front door. I was standing in the massive chef's kitchen of my penthouse suite, pouring a fresh cup of espresso and looking out over the panoramic, unobstructed views of Lake Michigan. The morning was perfectly quiet and serene. I had barely taken my first sip when the private elevator that opened directly into my foyer chimed unexpectedly. The only people with override access to that specific elevator were building management and my personal security detail, so I naturally assumed my concierge was dropping off a high-priority package. Instead, the heavy oak doors slid open to reveal Patricia and Richard. They marched right off the elevator and stepped onto my imported marble floors, carrying a stack of flattened cardboard moving boxes. My mother dropped the cardboard boxes onto my pristine entryway rug with a loud, obnoxious thud. She crossed her arms and surveyed my living room with a look of absolute disgust. She inspected the custom velvet sectionals, the crystal chandelier, and the original artwork hanging on the walls, clearly convinced that every single item was entirely bought on credit. She wasted no time pretending to be a concerned parent checking on her daughter. She smiled a tight, vicious little smile and announced that Brittany had shared the fantastic news. According to Patricia, the universe had finally stepped in to teach me a harsh lesson about arrogance and disrespect. She said my sister was an absolute saint for calling my employer and getting me fired because it forced me to stop living a delusional, flashy lie. Richard stepped forward aggressively, adjusting his country club golf shirt, and told me the family had graciously held an emergency meeting to decide my fate. Since I was now completely unemployed and entirely useless to the corporate world, they had devised a master plan for me to pay off my mounting debts and earn my keep. He pointed at the flattened cardboard boxes on the floor and ordered me to start packing my things immediately. Their grand solution to my imaginary financial crisis was that I would surrender my luxury penthouse move back into their damp, unfinished basement and serve as a full-time, unpaid nanny for Brittany and Malik. Patricia chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She added that taking care of my nephew and niece 24 hours a day would be my penance for humiliating Malik at the restaurant. She said that once I was living under their roof again, I could use whatever meager unemployment checks I collected to start paying them back for the food I ate and the electricity I used as a child. I stood perfectly still behind my kitchen island, holding my espresso cup, absolutely fascinated by the sheer depth of their delusion. I asked them calmly, what on earth made them think I would ever agree to surrender my peace and quiet, to become a glorified servant for a sister who just actively tried to ruin my career? Richard turned a deep shade of purple. He aggressively closed the distance between us, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings as he yelled that I had always been a colossal, ungrateful failure. He screamed that I was just renting a life I could not possibly afford, playing dress-up in a luxury high-rise, just like I tried to rent that expensive graduation gown they blatantly refused to pay for 8 years ago. He reminded me how I had to walk across my college stage in a cheap borrowed dress because I thought I was better than the family that raised me. He told me I was nothing but a fraud drowning in credit card debt and that I needed to submit to my betters before I ended up in jail. Patricia pulled out her cell phone and smugly declared that if I did not start packing my bags right this second, she was going to call the building management and have me physically thrown out onto the street as a jobless squatter. She said she would make sure my eviction was incredibly humiliating and painfully public, so all my wealthy neighbors could see the pathetic fraud I truly was. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I simply gestured toward the elevator with my free hand and told her to go right ahead and call them. Patricia furiously punched the button for the concierge on the wall panel, loudly demanding through the intercom that the building manager come up to the penthouse immediately to remove a highly belligerent delinquent tenant. We waited in tense, suffocating silence for exactly 3 minutes before the private elevator chimed again. Mr. Sterling, the impeccably dressed building manager, stepped into my foyer, flanked by two burly security guards in dark suits. Patricia immediately pointed her manicured finger at me, demanding that Mr. Sterling throw me out that very instant, because I had just lost my job and was completely incapable of paying the astronomical rent on this multi-million-dollar suite. She instructed the security guards to grab my arms and drag me to the service elevator. Mr. Sterling did not even look at my mother. He turned directly to me, gave a deep, respectful bow of his head, and asked if these unauthorized visitors were causing a disturbance that required police intervention. Patricia gasped in absolute outrage, her jaw dropping open in shock. But before she could scream at him for ignoring her commands, Mr. Sterling stepped smoothly past her and handed Richard a thick, laminated legal document. It was a permanent, legally binding trespass notice. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso and smiled at the two people who thought they could break me. I do not rent here, Dad. My real estate trust owns this entire building. Security escort them out. The heavy oak doors of the private elevator slid shut, instantly, silencing Patricia's frantic, echoing screams. I stood perfectly still behind my kitchen island, listening to the mechanical hum of the elevator carrying my parents down 40 floors to the street level. Richard had not said a single word. When Mr. Sterling handed him that permanent trespass notice, the color had completely drained from my father's face. He had stared at the laminated paper as if it were written in an alien language, entirely incapable of processing the fact that the daughter he viewed as a worthless failure was the legal owner of a $50 million residential skyscraper. I looked down at the cheap flattened cardboard boxes they had dumped on my imported rug. They actually brought moving boxes to pack up my life. I picked them up, walked over to the disposal chute, and dropped them into the darkness. I went back to my kitchen counter, took another slow sip of my espresso, and smiled. 3 days later, the atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was absolutely electric. It was the night of the Lux Retail Acquisition Gala. My firm, Aegis Financial Analytics, had officially purchased their entire flailing retail brand earlier that morning. The executives at Lux had spared absolutely no expense for the party, desperately hoping to impress their new corporate overlords and save their respective jobs. Massive, glittering ice sculptures carved into the shape of the company logo dominated the corners of the room. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided through the packed crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and vintage champagne. It was a spectacular display of borrowed wealth paid for entirely by the cash injection my company had just authorized. Right in the center of the ballroom, completely oblivious to the reality of her impending doom, stood Brittany. She was draped in a gaudy, sequined crimson gown that caught every flash of light, looking less like a corporate executive and more like a desperate reality television star. She held a crystal flute of champagne, practically vibrating with arrogance, as she paraded her family in front of her colleagues. Malik stood rigidly beside her, looking like a man marching toward a firing squad. The 48-hour grace period for his $2 million margin call had expired yesterday afternoon. His phone was buzzing relentlessly in his velvet jacket pocket. He was sweating completely through his shirt, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and vacant. Every single time he reached into his pocket to check the frantic notifications from his brokers, Brittany aggressively slapped his hand away. She hissed at him through a fake, brilliant smile, demanding that he stop ruining her perfect evening with his anxiety. She loudly announced to a circle of regional managers that the mysterious new CEO of the acquiring firm had personally requested her portfolio. She confidently boasted that her promotion to senior vice president was guaranteed to be announced before midnight. A few feet away, Patricia was holding court with the wives of the Lux Retail board members. I had specifically instructed my security team to allow my family entry to the gala, knowing exactly how they would behave once they were surrounded by an audience. Patricia held her wine glass with one hand and dramatically placed her other hand over her heart, perfectly, playing the role of the long-suffering, devoted mother. She leaned in closely to the chief financial officer's wife and let out a loud theatrical sigh. She claimed that the family had just endured a terrible, heartbreaking tragedy with her youngest daughter. She spun a fabricated, highly delusional narrative to the executives. She completely erased the memory of being legally thrown out of my penthouse. Instead, she claimed I was a jobless, homeless disaster who had recently suffered a massive psychotic break. She told the wealthy women that I was caught squatting in an empty apartment pretending I owned the building and that the police had to forcibly drag me away. She shook her head in mock sorrow, stating that they had to cut me off entirely to protect the family from my violent instability. She then seamlessly pivoted, gesturing proudly toward Brittany. She claimed that her eldest daughter's incredible corporate success was the only thing keeping the family together during such a dark, painful time. The executives politely nodded, drinking in the toxic gossip, while praising Patricia for her incredible maternal strength. I stepped out of my chauffeur-driven Maybach and walked into the grand lobby of the Drake Hotel. I was wearing a bespoke razor-sharp obsidian power suit. The $80,000 Patek Philippe watch rested prominently on my wrist, catching the light of the lobby chandeliers. I did not pull my sleeve down to hide it this time. I walked toward the ballroom with 12 of my top executives falling into perfect synchronized formation right behind me. Inside the ballroom, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The overhead lights dimmed, casting an expectant hush over the hundreds of guests. The current president of Lux Retail stepped up to the microphone on the grand stage. He cleared his throat, his voice echoing loudly through the massive speakers. He announced that the moment had finally arrived to welcome the board of directors from Aegis Financial Analytics and to introduce the visionary founder and chief executive officer who had orchestrated the entire buyout. Brittany practically shoved her colleagues out of the way to get to the front of the crowd. She dragged Malik by the wrist, forcing Patricia and Richard to follow close behind her. She wanted to be the very first person the new CEO saw. She wanted to be front and center when her name was called for her massive promotion. The heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a loud, resounding crack. A bright spotlight hit the entryway. My board of directors walked into the room, their expressions stone cold and strictly professional. The crowd murmured in absolute awe. The board members marched 10 paces forward, stopped in perfect unison, and then parted down the middle like the Red Sea. I stepped through the gap and walked directly into the blinding spotlight. I kept my head held high, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I looked straight ahead and locked eyes with Brittany. The smug, triumphant smile melted off her face in a fraction of a second. Her jaw dropped open. Her crystal champagne flute slipped from her paralyzed fingers and shattered violently against the floor. Patricia let out a loud, genuine gasp of absolute terror, her hands flying to cover her mouth as the blood completely drained from her face. Richard stumbled backward, bumping heavily into a waiter and nearly collapsing into a table of hors d'oeuvres. Malik just stared at me, his legs giving out as the reality of his total financial ruin finally cemented itself in his mind. I stood at the center of the ballroom looking at the sister who had just called my HR department to get me fired and offered her a cold, unforgiving smile. I did not break eye contact with Brittany as I stepped over the shattered crystal of her dropped champagne flute. The crunch of glass under my designer heels was the only sound echoing in the completely silent ballroom. The crowd of elite executives parted for me, their faces painted with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. As I glided past my family, I could hear Malik's ragged, shallow breathing. He was literally hyperventilating, his hands violently trembling at his sides as the reality of his massive margin call finally aligned with the absolute power I now wielded over his life. Richard was practically shrinking into his ill-fitting tuxedo, desperately trying to hide behind a massive floral arrangement. Patricia stood frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. She was entirely unable to comprehend that the homeless psychotic squatter she had just spent 20 minutes gossiping about was currently marching up the steps to the grand stage. I stepped up to the acrylic podium and adjusted the microphone. I looked out over the sea of Lux Retail employees. The room was so incredibly quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. "Good evening," I said, my voice carrying a smooth, razor-sharp authority that commanded immediate respect. As your former president just announced, Aegis Financial Analytics has officially finalized the total acquisition of Lux Retail. We did not purchase this company to maintain the status quo. We bought it because we identified massive glaring inefficiencies in your corporate structure. My firm specializes in forensic restructuring. That means we are here to completely overhaul this brand, streamline operations, and most importantly, cut out the corporate deadweight that has been bleeding this company dry for years. A collective shudder rippled through the audience. The regional managers and senior vice presidents who had been drinking expensive vintage champagne just moments ago suddenly looked nauseous. They knew exactly what forensic restructuring meant in the corporate world. It meant ruthless financial audits, massive layoffs, and the immediate termination of anyone who had been coasting on a padded salary. I gripped the edges of the podium and let my cold gaze sweep across the room before landing squarely back on the center of the floor. My family looked like they wanted the polished marble to open up and swallow them whole. Transparency is a core value at Aegis. I continued amplifying my voice so it reached the very back of the massive ballroom. So, in the spirit of total corporate transparency, I would like to take a moment to address a specific incident that occurred just this morning. I would like to personally thank your marketing director, Brittany, who recently called my human resources department to urgently request my termination. The entire ballroom collectively gasped. Hundreds of heads violently swiveled to stare directly at Brittany. The executives who had been forced to endure her arrogant boasting all evening now looked at her with pure unadulterated horror. Brittany's face turned a sickening shade of magenta. She physically recoiled, looking frantically around the room as the colleagues she had been trying to impress suddenly backed away from her. They treated her like she was actively contagious, leaving her standing entirely alone in the center of the room with Malik and my parents. "It was a bold move," I said, my voice dripping with lethal sarcasm. Calling the HR department of the acquiring firm to falsely accuse an employee of grand larceny and severe mental instability takes a very special kind of audacity. Unfortunately for her, firing the owner of the company is a logistical nightmare. The tense silence completely shattered. Hushed whispers erupted across the ballroom like wildfire. The executives were staring at Brittany with absolute disgust, quickly realizing that she had just tried to sabotage the very billionaire CEO who now held their careers in the palm of her hand. Patricia grabbed Richard's arm, looking like she was about to faint from the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. The toxic narrative she had spun about my miserable, pathetic life had just been incinerated in front of the most elite corporate circle in the city. The sheer embarrassment finally snapped Brittany out of her paralyzed state. The reality that her entire corporate career, her social standing, and her desperate bid for a senior vice president title were currently going up in flames pushed her into absolute panic. She completely abandoned her sophisticated executive persona. She lunged forward, pushing past a group of terrified regional managers and tried to rush the stage. "Simone, wait!" Brittany cried out, her voice shrill and desperate, as she scrambled toward the short staircase. "Simone, please, we are sisters. We are family. You know I did not mean any of that. It was just a silly misunderstanding. We need to talk about this privately." Before her foot could even touch the first step, two of my massive stone-faced security guards stepped smoothly into her path. They moved with terrifying precision, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and tailored suits between Brittany and the stage. They did not touch her, but their imposing presence forced her to stop dead in her tracks. I calmly stepped away from the podium. I walked down the short staircase and stopped on the bottom step, standing perfectly safe behind the broad shoulders of my security team. I looked down at my older sister. She was sweating her sequined crimson dress, looking cheap and ridiculous under the harsh stage lights. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with a frantic begging plea for mercy that I had absolutely no intention of granting. I reached out my right hand. Marcus, my vice president of human resources, stepped out from the shadows of the stage wing and placed a thick red manila folder directly into my palm. I held the heavy file up, making sure Brittany could clearly read the bold black letters printed across the front label. It was stamped with the Aegis corporate audit seal. "I am afraid we are entirely past the point of sisterly misunderstandings," I said, maintaining a chillingly calm tone as I handed the thick audit file directly into her trembling hands. "We need to talk about your expense report, sister. We need to talk about your expense report, sister." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Brittany stared down at the red manila folder in her trembling hands as if it were a live grenade. She could not speak. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the cardboard so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. I did not wait for her to formulate a pathetic excuse. I turned to the two lead corporate attorneys standing to my right and gave them a subtle nod. They immediately flanked Brittany, gesturing politely but firmly toward the grand staircase that led to the mezzanine level. Overlooking the ballroom was the Lux Retail Executive Boardroom, a massive, soundproof glass enclosure designed to make the executives feel like gods looking down on their employees. Tonight, it would serve as an interrogation room. I walked up the stairs with measured, deliberate steps, knowing the eyes of every single person in the ballroom were glued to my back. Brittany was forced to follow, escorted by my legal team and surrounded by my security detail. It was a completely silent, agonizing walk of shame. Patricia and Richard tried to follow, desperately shouting my name from the base of the stairs, but my security guards firmly blocked their path, leaving my parents trapped on the ballroom floor to watch the impending destruction of their favorite child through a wall of soundproof glass. I stepped into the boardroom, walked directly to the head of the massive mahogany table, and took my seat. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind us, instantly cutting off the music and the murmurs of the crowd below. It was perfectly quiet. I gestured toward the empty leather chair opposite me. Brittany collapsed into it. She dropped the red folder onto the polished wood as if it were burning her skin. She looked frantically through the glass wall at our parents pacing nervously below, then looked back at me. Her chest heaved with panicked, shallow breaths. "Open it," I commanded, my voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty room. Brittany shook her head violently. She crossed her arms tightly over her sequined gown, reverting to the petulant, stubborn child she had always been when backed into a corner. I did not ask twice. I simply opened the duplicate file resting in front of me and pulled out a thick stack of highlighted forensic accounting reports. My firm did not just buy Lux Retail blindly. I began sliding a glossy photograph of a luxury sports car across the table toward her. We conducted a deep, exhaustive forensic audit of the entire corporate structure. We found massive bleeding wounds in the quarterly budgets. More specifically, we found you. I picked up the first page of the audit. "Let us review your activities for the last fiscal year, shall we?" In March, you authorized a $50,000 wire transfer from the corporate marketing budget for a supposed brand awareness retreat in St. Bart's. Our auditors verified that there were no clients present. It was just you, Malik, and a private yacht charter. Brittany swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the two corporate lawyers standing silently by the door. "That was team building," she stammered, her voice cracking. "It was a strategic networking opportunity." I did not let her finish. I pulled out another sheet of paper. "In April, you expensed $12,000 categorized under client appreciation gifts. Curiously, the vendor identification numbers perfectly match the receipts from the Hermes boutique on Oak Street. You bought yourself 3 Birkin bags and charged them to the company." And my personal favorite? I continued, sliding the photograph of the car closer to her. "Since last August, you have authorized a monthly recurring vendor consulting fee of $4,000 to a shell company registered in Delaware. Our team traced the routing numbers. Those corporate funds are directly paying the lease on Malik's Aston Martin." "That is a lie," Brittany shouted, her voice shrill and desperate as she slapped her hand against the table. "You are making this up to ruin me because you have always been jealous of my success. You forged these documents." I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. "These are bank-verified wire transfers, IP logs, and digital receipts extracted directly from your secure corporate terminal. The paper trail is absolutely flawless. You have been treating this company like your own personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle you could not actually afford. You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars to pretend you were rich. The reality of the evidence finally shattered her delusion. The arrogant, untouchable golden child completely vanished, replaced by a cornered, terrified fraud. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face as she leaned across the mahogany table, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged energy. "I deserve this!" Brittany screamed, her voice echoing violently off the glass walls. "I am the face of this brand. I am the one who networks. I am the one who schmoozes these pathetic regional managers. Mom and Dad always said I was meant for greatness. They said the world owes me. I earned everything I took." I stared at her, absolutely repulsed by the sheer depth of her entitlement. She had been coddled and praised for so long that she genuinely believed the rules did not apply to her. I sat back in my chair, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy. "Mom and Dad owed you," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and icy cold. "The SEC does not." Brittany recoiled as if I had physically struck her. The mention of federal authorities instantly sucked the remaining defiance right out of her lungs. She began to shake uncontrollably. She looked down at the highlighted audit files scattered across the table, finally realizing that this was not a simple family argument she could manipulate her way out of. This was not about getting fired. This was about federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. "You are looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison," I stated plainly, letting the silence emphasize the gravity of the threat. "The moment I hand this file to the authorities, your life as you know it is entirely over. The cars, the vacations, the country club memberships, they are all gone. You are going to lose everything, Brittany. And Patricia and Richard will have to watch their perfect golden child be dragged out of a courtroom in handcuffs." "Please," Brittany whispered, tears finally spilling over her mascara and running down her cheeks. "Simone, please. You cannot do this to me. I will pay it back. I will figure out a way to pay back every single cent. Just let me resign. Let me walk away quietly." I looked at my older sister crying across the table. For years, she had taken immense pleasure in making me feel worthless. She had actively tried to destroy my career just days ago without a single ounce of hesitation. I felt absolutely no guilt. I closed my duplicate folder and tapped it neatly against the polished wood. I turned my head toward my lead corporate counsel. I extended my arm, holding the damning audit file out to him. "Contact the federal authorities," I instructed the lawyer. "Hand over all our forensic evidence to the SEC and initiate the criminal prosecution protocols immediately." The lawyer stepped forward, extending his hand to take the file that would seal Brittany's fate. Suddenly, a loud, violent crash shattered the quiet tension of the room. The heavy, soundproof glass door of the boardroom was violently kicked open, slamming hard against the interior wall. The glass shuddered under the immense impact. Malik stood in the doorway, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his tie ripped open, and his dress shirt soaked in nervous sweat. His chest heaved as he glared at me with desperate, unhinged fury. "You put that file down right now!" Simone, Malik demanded, his voice cracking with a dangerous, explosive panic. "You are going to back down, or I swear to God I will make you regret it." Malik stormed fully into the executive boardroom, his heavy footsteps echoing violently against the acoustic panels. He marched directly toward the head of the mahogany table, completely ignoring the two highly trained corporate security guards who instantly stepped off the wall to intercept him. His face was a dangerously dark shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his sweat-soaked collar. He slammed both of his fists down onto the polished wood, mere inches from my laptop, leaning his massive frame forward in a blatant, aggressive attempt to physically tower over me. The two security guards immediately unclipped the holsters at their waists, moving in to physically subdue him. I did not flinch. I did not lean back in my leather chair. I simply raised a single manicured finger into the air. The guards froze, instantly stepping back but remaining perfectly coiled to strike. I wanted to handle Malik myself. "You are going to rip up that audit right now," Malik sneered, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. You are going to sign the paperwork making Brittany the senior vice president of marketing, and you are going to keep your mouth shut. We are your family, Simone. You owe us. When your very first startup went under 5 years ago, I was the one who graciously let you sleep on our brand new sectional sofa. I was the one who bought you groceries when you could not even afford a decent meal. You are just a bitter, jealous little girl playing dress up with a corporate credit card, and I'm telling you to fix this right now for the sake of the family. I sat perfectly still, listening to the sheer, unadulterated delusion pouring out of his mouth. He genuinely believed he could intimidate the owner of a multi-billion-dollar financial firm by bringing up a bag of groceries he bought half a decade ago. I looked past his sweating, furious face and glanced through the soundproof glass walls of the boardroom. Down on the ballroom floor, Patricia and Richard were pacing frantically, staring up at the glass box, completely oblivious to the fact that their golden son-in-law was about to detonate a financial nuclear bomb right in the middle of their perfect suburban lives. I slowly leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and met his crazed stare with absolute freezing calm. You are in no position to issue demands, Malik. I reached down into the sleek leather briefcase resting against the leg of my chair. I bypassed the standard corporate files and pulled out a thick black portfolio stamped with a silver crest. I dropped it squarely on top of Brittany's red embezzlement audit. The heavy thud made Malik flinch. "Let us talk about your day trading addiction," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. You have been aggressively leveraging positions on volatile tech stocks for the last 18 months, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of massive wealth. Yesterday afternoon, Apex Trading hit you with a massive margin call. You are exactly $2 million in the red. They gave you a strict 48-hour grace period to cover the deficit, a period that expired at 3 o'clock today. Malik swallowed hard, the remaining color draining rapidly from his face. He stumbled backward, his aggressive posture collapsing entirely. "How do you know about Apex?" he choked out, his eyes darting frantically toward the black folder. "Because institutional lenders do not wait around for fake millionaires to find loose change in their couch cushions," I stated flatly. When an account defaults, this severely brokerage firms immediately package the toxic debt and sell it to private collection agencies for pennies on the dollar, just to clear it off their balance sheets. Apex Trading sold your toxic defaulted portfolio to a highly aggressive Tier 1 private equity firm early this morning, a firm that I personally own. I tapped the black folder with my index finger. "I own your debt, Malik, every single cent of it." Brittany let out a strangled, breathless gasp from the other side of the table. She looked at her husband with absolute horror, the realization dawning on her that the lavish lifestyle she had been bragging about all night was built entirely on a mountain of catastrophic debt. Malik shook his head wildly, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. "It does not matter," Malik stammered, his voice rising in panic. "I can cover the margin. Once you give Brittany her promotion and her signing bonus, we can restructure the payments. We will pay you back. We are family. Simone, you cannot ruin us." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the glass walls. "You are completely missing the most vital piece of the puzzle, Malik. A man with maxed-out credit cards and a leased Aston Martin does not simply walk into a Tier 1 brokerage firm and secure a $2 million leverage account. Apex Trading requires pristine liquid collateral to underwrite that kind of high-risk margin. I opened the black folder and pulled out a single, heavily redacted legal contract. I slid the document smoothly across the mahogany table until it rested right in front of Brittany. "Read the collateral agreement, sister," I commanded. Brittany leaned forward, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the paper. She scanned the dense legal text, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as she reached the bottom of the page. "You did not use your own money to secure that margin, Malik," I explained, making sure my voice was loud enough to drown out his pathetic, panicked whimpers. "You committed federal wire fraud. You bypassed dual authentication security and illegally forged the digital signatures of Richard and Patricia. You pledged their entire 401k retirement accounts and signed away the remaining equity on their house as the collateral for your failed gambling addiction. No, Brittany screamed a guttural, agonizing sound as she shoved the paper away and stared at her husband in total revulsion. Tell me this is a lie, Malik. Tell me you did not steal Mom and Dad's retirement. Malik could not speak. He backed up against the glass wall, hyperventilating as he looked down at my parents who were still staring up at the boardroom, completely unaware that their beloved son-in-law had just gambled away their entire life savings and the roof over their heads. He turned back to me, clasping his hands together in a desperate, pathetic, pleading motion. Simone, please, I am begging you. Malik cried, tears streaming down his face as his knees buckled. Do not do this. Please, for the sake of the family, do not call the dead in. I will do anything. My face turned to stone. I reached out toward the silver telecommunications console built directly into the center of the boardroom table. I looked directly into Malik's terrified, bloodshot eyes and pressed the flashing red intercom button that connected securely to my primary wealth management team. I just notified Apex to execute the margin call. I announced, my voice devoid of any mercy. You are officially bankrupt, Malik, and my parents are going to lose their house. Malik collapsed onto the plush carpeting of the boardroom as the finality of my words echoed through the intercom. The arrogant, posturing husband who had just kicked open my door was entirely gone, replaced by a hyperventilating shell of a man, realizing his fraudulent house of cards had just been vaporized. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, but I did not offer him a single glance of sympathy. The heavy mahogany door was still wide open, shattering the soundproof seal of the executive glass box. Over the ragged sounds of Malik breathing, a new commotion erupted from the grand staircase. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded against the marble steps. Richard and Patricia burst into the boardroom, completely ignoring my security detail who stepped aside on my silent command. Richard was gripping his smartphone so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His face was a terrifying mask of purple rage. Just seconds ago, down in the ballroom, his bank had sent a catastrophic cascade of automated fraud alerts directly to his phone. The notification was blunt and uncompromising. His entire retirement portfolio, every single mutual fund, and the deed to his suburban home had been instantly frozen and seized by Apex Trading to cover a defaulted margin call. He marched directly toward my side of the table, shoving past his sobbing son-in-law. He slammed his phone down onto the glass surface, the screen displaying the zero balance of his life savings. "What did you just do?" Richard screamed, the veins in his neck bulging as he glared down at me. "My accounts are frozen. The bank just seized the house." "What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing with our lives, Simone?" I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I simply tapped the heavily redacted collateral contract sitting in front of his precious eldest daughter. "I did not do anything to your accounts, Richard," I replied, my tone deliberately flat and clinical. "Malik forged both of your digital signatures to secure a $2 million leverage loan for his day trading addiction. He lost the money. The broker called in the debt. Your golden son-in-law just gambled away your retirement and the roof over your head." I expected shock. I expected Richard to turn around and violently confront the man who had just stolen decades of his hard-earned money. I expected Patricia to scream at the man who had bankrupted her. Instead, I witnessed a masterclass in psychological delusion. Patricia rushed to Malik, dropping to her knees to wrap her arms protectively around the very man who had just financially ruined her. She glared up at me with absolute, unfiltered hatred. "He is family!" Patricia shrieked, holding a sobbing Malik against her shoulder. "He was just trying to provide for Brittany. He would have won the money back. You are a billionaire, Simone. You own the trading firm. You could have quietly erased the debt. You could have fixed this without destroying our lives. You did this to us on purpose because you are a vindictive, hateful child." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the cold air of the boardroom. She was actively shielding a federal criminal while blaming me for his crimes simply because I refused to cover his multi-million-dollar theft. Richard slammed his fist against the table, demanding my immediate compliance. "You are going to pick up that phone right now and call your brokers," he ordered, his voice dripping with the familiar dictatorial entitlement of my childhood. You are going to authorize a complete release of our assets. You are going to pay off whatever Malik owes, and you are going to restore our accounts to their full balance. You have the money. It is pennies to you. You owe this family, and you are going to fix this mess. I slowly leaned back in my leather chair, perfectly calm amidst their collective hysteria. I owe you nothing, I stated, staring directly into Richard's furious eyes. You made your bed when you stood in my penthouse and demanded I become an unpaid servant to a sister who actively tried to ruin my career. You co-signed Brittany's delusion. Now you get to co-sign Malik's bankruptcy. The margin call stands. You will be vacating your home by the end of the month. Patricia scrambled to her feet, abandoning Malik on the floor. She marched right up to the edge of the mahogany table, pointing a manicured finger aggressively at my face. She decided to deploy the only weapon she thought she had left. You think you are so untouchable up here in your glass tower? Patricia spat, her voice trembling with venomous spite. If you do not unfreeze those accounts right this second, I am going straight to the press. I will call the Wall Street Journal. I will call every local news station in this city. I will tell them exactly what kind of monster runs Aegis Financial Analytics. She leaned closer, her eyes manic. I will tell them how you financially abuse your elderly parents. I will paint you as a ruthless, soulless corporate tyrant who threw her own mother and father out onto the street just to satisfy a petty childhood grudge. I will turn you into a public relations nightmare. I will tank your company's stock by morning. You will be the most hated woman in the corporate world. Unfreeze the accounts, Simone, or I will destroy your reputation. The silence that followed her threat was profound. My legal team tensed, ready to intervene, but I raised my hand to stop them. I looked at my mother, analyzing the desperate, cornered animal she had become. Go ahead, I replied, my voice smooth as silk. Call the press, Patricia. Call the Wall Street Journal. Tell them how your son-in-law committed federal wire fraud and embezzled your retirement. Tell them how you tried to extort a billionaire CEO to cover up a felony. And while you are at it, make sure you mention that this entire boardroom is actively recording audio and video for corporate security purposes. Patricia froze her eyes instinctively, darting up to the sleek black security cameras mounted discreetly in the corners of the ceiling. The color drained from her face as the reality of her extortion attempt fully registered. A public relations war requires two things, Mother. I continued, my gaze pinning her in place. Unimpeachable credibility and massive amounts of capital. You currently possess neither. If you utter a single word to the press, my legal team will bury you in so much defamation litigation you will not even be able to afford a cardboard box to live in. Now step back. Patricia stumbled backward as if she had been shoved. Her threat was entirely neutralized, leaving her utterly powerless. I dismissed her from my attention and turned my focus back to the primary target. Brittany had been sitting entirely paralyzed in her chair throughout the entire exchange, clutching the red audit folder like a shield. She looked completely hollowed out, watching her husband sob on the floor, and her parents realized they were homeless. I reached into my briefcase one final time. I pulled out a crisp white envelope and a thick, legally binding contract printed on heavy bond paper. I slid them slowly across the polished wood until they rested perfectly next to her embezzlement audit. Your husband's financial ruin is a separate legal matter from your corporate theft, I told Brittany, my tone shifting to pure, unyielding business. You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from Lux Retail. I have the digital receipts, the vendor logs, and the explicit proof of your embezzlement. The federal authorities would be thrilled to prosecute a high-profile fraud case. Brittany stared at the white envelope, her hands shaking violently. What is that? She choked out, barely able to form the words. That is a non-disclosure agreement and a revised employment contract, I explained, tapping the heavy paper. I am offering you a singular, non-negotiable lifeline. You have a choice, sister. You can walk out of this room right now, and I will hand your audit directly to the authorities. You will go to federal prison for corporate embezzlement, and you will share a cell block while your husband answers for wire fraud. I leaned forward, dropping the final crushing blow. Or you can sign that contract. You will surrender your current title. You will forfeit all bonuses and equity, and you will accept a permanent, non-negotiable demotion to become my personal entry-level junior assistant. Choose wisely. Choose wisely. The words hung over the mahogany table, sharp and absolute. Brittany stared at the stark black ink of the demotion contract. Her hands shook so violently that the heavy bond paper vibrated against the polished wood. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for a sliver of the sisterly affection she had spent 3 decades actively destroying. She found absolutely nothing. My face was a mask of corporate execution. Brittany looked wildly toward the glass wall, seeking salvation from our mother. Patricia was paralyzed, her manicured hands covering her mouth as she stared at the wreckage of her entire world. Richard was slumped against the glass, his eyes vacant, fully comprehending that Malik had gambled away his retirement. Nobody was going to save the golden child tonight. With a ragged, humiliated sob, Brittany reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen resting beside the contract. Her tears splashed onto the signature lines, smudging the ink as she hastily scrawled her name. She pushed the paper across the table, completely defeated. "Corporate card," I demanded, extending my open palm. Brittany blinked, still struggling to process her new reality. I did not give her time to hesitate. I snapped my fingers. "Hand it over, Brittany. The platinum card, the keys to the executive washroom, your VIP parking garage pass, and your security clearance badge. You no longer hold a vice president title, which means you no longer require executive privileges." Her face flushed a deep, sickening crimson. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she unclasped her designer clutch. She pulled out the heavy metal corporate card she had used to fund her fraudulent, glamorous life and dropped it into my hand. The parking pass and security badge followed. Each item hit the mahogany table with a quiet, final clatter. "Marcus," I said, turning to my vice president of human resources who stood silently by the door. "Escort my new junior assistant to her former office. Provide her with one standard cardboard banker's box. She has exactly 15 minutes to remove her personal items before security locks the suite." Brittany gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Simone, please, I have years of files in there. I have awards. I have personal artwork. You cannot make me pack up my entire life in 15 minutes. "You are right," I replied smoothly, rising from my leather chair. "You do not have years of files. Those belong to Aegis Financial Analytics now. You may take your framed photos and your desk plant. Everything else is corporate property. Move." My security guards flanked her instantly. They did not touch her, but their imposing physical presence forced her to stand up. She stumbled toward the heavy glass doors. Patricia rushed forward, grabbing Brittany by the shoulders and pulling her into a desperate, clinging hug. They wept together, a tragic portrait of entitlement completely shattered. I walked past them without breaking my stride. I led the procession out of the boardroom and down the grand staircase, stepping back onto the ballroom floor. The gala had been suspended in a state of terrified limbo. Hundreds of Lux retail employees stood frozen, holding their champagne flutes, watching the spectacle unfold. We marched down the main executive corridor. The regional managers and department heads who had endured Brittany's arrogant tyranny for years now lined the glass walls of their offices. They watched in sheer, unadulterated awe as the untouchable marketing queen was marched down the hall by armed security. We reached the end of the corridor. Brittany's corner office was a ridiculous monument to her ego. It featured panoramic views of the city skyline, white leather sofas, and a massive marble desk. Marcus stepped inside and placed a single cheap cardboard box directly onto the pristine marble. "Your 15 minutes starts now," Marcus stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Brittany lunged for her desk, weeping hysterically as she began shoving her expensive silver picture frames, her designer makeup bags, and her crystal paperweights into the cheap brown box. She looked pathetic. The glamorous, terrifying executive persona she had worn for years was gone, replaced by a frantic, broken woman stuffing her life into a cardboard cube. Patricia stood in the doorway, absolutely horrified. She clutched Richard's arm, her eyes wide with disbelief as she watched her perfect daughter being stripped of her crown. "This is inhumane," Patricia hissed at me, her voice shaking with venom. "You are enjoying this. You are a sick, twisted girl, Simone. She is your sister. She is a vice president. She is a felon who just signed a plea bargain to avoid a federal indictment, I corrected, not even bothering to look at my mother. And you are a woman who has exactly 29 days to pack up her own house before my collection agency changes your locks. I suggest you go home and start finding boxes of your own. Patricia's mouth snapped shut. The reality of her own impending homelessness finally silenced her completely. Time is up, Marcus announced, stepping forward. Brittany grabbed the cardboard box, her knuckles white. She looked around her luxurious corner office one last time. A fresh wave of tears spilling down her face as my security guard stepped forward and ushered her out into the hallway. "Follow me," I commanded. I did not lead her toward the elevators. I led her away from the executive wing, marching her straight toward the administrative sector. The plush carpeting gave way to industrial gray tiles. The panoramic glass offices transitioned into a sea of cramped beige cubicles. The administrative staff, the people Brittany had openly mocked and treated like dirt, stared openly as we approached. I stopped precisely outside the massive double doors of the CEO suite, my new office. Right outside the heavy oak doors sat a tiny windowless cubicle. It was gray, claustrophobic, and entirely isolated from the rest of the floor. It had a cheap laminate desk, a plastic chair, and a standard-issue computer terminal. I gestured toward the gray box. "Put your things down, Brittany." Brittany stood frozen, her eyes darting from the tiny cubicle to my face. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Simone, I cannot work in here. There is no window. There is no space. People will see me." "You are a junior assistant," I replied, my voice carrying clearly across the silent floor. "Junior assistants do not get corner offices with skyline views. They sit where they are told. Put the box down." She slowly lowered the cardboard box onto the cheap laminate desk. She looked completely defeated, a ghost of the woman who had tormented me my entire life. Patricia let out a strangled sob from the hallway, completely unable to bear the sight of her favorite child sitting in a windowless cage. I turned around and walked into my new CEO suite. I walked over to the massive executive desk and picked up a heavy plastic bin. It was overflowing with thousands of faded, crinkled, completely disorganized corporate receipts dating back 5 years. I walked back out to the cubicle and slammed the massive bin down onto Brittany's desk. The impact rattled her cardboard box, nearly knocking over her framed photos. She jumped back, staring at the mountain of paper in pure horror. "Aegis Financial requires a complete physical audit of all historical expenses," I said, leaning down so my face was merely inches from hers. "Sort these chronologically, cross-reference them with the digital ledgers, and flag any discrepancies." I straightened my suit jacket and looked down at her with absolute authority. "Sort these by 5 o'clock. Welcome to the bottom of the food chain." I walked into my massive suite and let the heavy oak doors click shut, leaving Brittany completely alone in her gray box with a plastic bin of crumpled paper. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the reality of her new existence had fully set in. She arrived at the office wearing a subdued off-the-rack pantsuit, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. She walked tentatively toward my desk, holding a legal pad, waiting for me to acknowledge her. I did not look up from my quarterly projections. I slid a yellow sticky note across the polished mahogany. It contained the highly specific customized coffee orders for the entire executive board. 8 years ago, on the morning of my very first corporate interview, Brittany had stood in the foyer of our parents' house and intentionally dumped a scalding Americano directly onto my only tailored blazer. She had laughed, claiming I was too pathetic and poorly dressed to ever survive in a real boardroom anyway, forcing me to attend the interview in a damp-stained shirt. Today, she returned to the suite 20 minutes later, her wrists physically trembling under the weight of a flimsy cardboard tray holding 6 oversized cups. She approached my desk, terrified of spilling a single drop on the marble floor. She placed my black coffee onto the leather coaster with painstaking care. I placed my hand against the side of the paper cup. "The temperature is incorrect," I stated flatly, keeping my eyes fixed entirely on my monitor. "Go back down to the lobby and have them remake it." Brittany choked back a ragged sob. She spun on her heel, grabbed the cup, and practically ran out of the office. I offered absolutely zero emotional response. That was the specific tactic that was slowly driving her insane. She desperately craved a screaming match. She wanted me to gloat, to yell, to rub my wealth in her face so she could play the victim and manipulate the narrative. By treating her like a nameless, faceless piece of office machinery, I systematically stripped away the last remaining shreds of her power. The week dragged on, transforming into a grueling physical nightmare for her. The woman who used to spend her afternoons taking 3-hour lunches at five-star restaurants was now sprinting across the building delivering mail. I made her organize the supply closets. I forced her to manually shred hundreds of outdated legal documents until her perfectly manicured nails were chipped and ruined. Every time she tried to initiate a personal conversation, trying to leverage our shared childhood to gain a momentary reprieve, I simply handed her another stack of files to alphabetize. By Thursday afternoon, the psychological toll was absolute. Aegis Financial Analytics was hosting a critical multi-million-dollar acquisition pitch. We were finalizing a massive retail partnership with the Vanguard Group. The Vanguard Executive Board included Victoria Sterling and Chloe Vance. These were women Brittany had played tennis with every Tuesday at the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. They were the elite socialites she had spent thousands of stolen corporate dollars trying to impress. 10 minutes before the Vanguard executives were scheduled to arrive, I summoned Brittany to my desk. I handed her a dry cleaning ticket. "Go to the tailor on the ground floor and retrieve my suits," I instructed. "Be quick about it." I timed the collision perfectly. I was standing in the center of the glass-walled executive lobby shaking hands with Victoria and Chloe when the main elevator doors chimed open. Brittany stepped out. She was struggling to carry 3 heavy plastic-wrapped suits draped over one arm while balancing a massive tray of catered sandwiches in the other hand. Her hair was frizzy from the humidity outside, and her cheap blazer was wrinkled. Victoria actually gasped, taking a step back in sheer shock. "Brittany, what on earth are you doing?" Brittany froze like a deer in headlights. The color drained entirely from her face. One of the heavy suit bags slipped from her shoulder, landing on the floor with a pathetic swoosh. She tried to smile desperately, trying to project her old, arrogant country club persona. "Victoria, Chloe, I am just restructuring my workflow. I am taking a hands-on approach to the new corporate transition." I stepped smoothly forward and picked up my dry cleaning from the floor. "My junior assistant is still adjusting to the pace of the administrative sector," I told the Vanguard executives, my voice perfectly polite and entirely dismissive. "Brittany, take the catering to the main conference room and wipe down the whiteboards before you take your 15-minute lunch break." The absolute humiliation hit Brittany with the force of a freight train. Victoria and Chloe looked at her not with anger, but with pure, unfiltered pity. They looked at the former queen of the country club as if she were the hired help. Brittany's chest heaved. She scrambled to adjust the sandwich tray, ducked her head, and practically sprinted down the hallway to escape their staring eyes. The utter degradation finally broke whatever fragile restraint she had left. Hidden inside the main conference room, her humiliation curdled into a toxic, reckless rage. She was setting up the water glasses when she noticed my master presentation laptop resting unattended on the podium. I was still out in the lobby giving the clients a brief tour of the architectural models. Brittany knew her basic administrative access codes still worked on the local network. She slipped behind the podium and opened the presentation file. It took her less than 30 seconds. She accessed the master slide deck for the Vanguard acquisition. She highlighted the core financial projections, the margin analysis, and the 10-year growth models that justified the entire buyout. She hit delete, permanently corrupted the backup autosave file, and quietly slipped out the back door of the boardroom. 10 minutes later, I stood at the head of the massive mahogany table. The Vanguard executives sat comfortably holding their branded pens and watching me expectantly. Brittany stood in the far back corner of the room holding a notepad. A sinister, triumphant smirk had finally returned to her face. She was waiting for me to publicly fail, waiting for my billion-dollar deal to collapse in front of the very women she wanted to impress. I picked up the laser pointer. I confidently pressed the button to bring up the primary financial models. The massive projector screen behind me flashed bright white hist and then displayed a massive fatal file error message. The harsh blue light of the error screen illuminated the room, casting an icy glow across the faces of the Vanguard executives. Victoria and Chloe shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, exchanging a quick, concerned glance. In the back corner of the boardroom, Brittany stood with her arms crossed over her cheap, wrinkled pantsuit. A toxic, triumphant smirk was plastered across her face. She shifted her weight, practically vibrating with eager anticipation. She was waiting for me to apologize. She was waiting for me to sweat to panic, to crumble into a pathetic, flustered mess in front of the most powerful women in the retail sector. I looked at the fatal error message flashing on the massive screen. I looked at Brittany. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of apology to my clients. I reached out and calmly pressed the master power switch on the podium console. The projector hummed and powered down, plunging the front of the room back into sophisticated ambient lighting. I stepped away from the podium, abandoning the useless laptop entirely, and walked directly to the center of the mahogany table. Ladies, a digital slide deck is merely a visual crutch for executives who do not intimately understand their own capital, I said, my voice steady, smooth, and absolute. Let us talk raw, unfiltered numbers. I launched directly into the pitch. I used no notes. I referenced no visuals. I delivered pure, unadulterated financial mastery. Vanguard's current retail acquisitions are suffering a 12% attrition rate due to outdated logistical algorithms, I stated, pacing slowly at the head of the table. Aegis Financial Analytics has developed a proprietary predictive margin analysis model. By restructuring your debt-to-equity ratio and liquidating your underperforming regional assets, we project a 24% revenue increase within the first 36 months. I did not stop there. I rattled off complex algorithms, quarterly yield projections, and international market volatility metrics with flawless precision. Our 10-year growth models indicate that absorbing Lux Retail's supply chain infrastructure will reduce your overhead by $40 million annually. I continued, my gaze sweeping between Victoria and Chloe. We accomplished this by entirely restructuring corporate vendor contracts, executing aggressive tax deferment strategies, and eliminating bloated, unnecessary executive compensation packages. I let my eyes drift to Brittany on that last sentence. Her triumphant smirk instantly vanished. The realization hit my older sister like a physical blow to the chest. She had actually believed that deleting a digital file would break me. She completely failed to comprehend that I did not just buy this massive financial firm, I built my entire empire from scratch, using nothing but my own intellect and ruthless ambition. I knew every single algorithm, every fractional percentage, and every market projection because I had written them myself while she was busy attending daytime charity luncheons on our father's dime. Victoria Sterling leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together on the table, completely captivated by the presentation. Chloe Vance was furiously taking notes on her leather-bound legal pad. They began firing off aggressive high-level questions about domestic shipping tariffs and competitive market saturation. I answered each one instantly, citing exact figures and historical data trends without a second of hesitation. The energy in the room shifted entirely from a potential technical disaster to an absolute masterclass in corporate dominance. We are offering a complete forensic overhaul, I concluded, resting my hands flat on the polished mahogany table and leaning forward to hold Victoria's gaze. Aegis provides the analytical architecture, and Vanguard scales its retail footprint. It is a mutually guaranteed monopoly. The room fell into a heavy, charged silence. Victoria closed her portfolio with a decisive snap. She looked at Chloe, who gave a definitive, firm nod of approval. Victoria stood up, adjusting the cuffs of her immaculate blazer, and extended her hand across the table. I have sat through hundreds of acquisitions in my career, Simone. Victoria said, her voice ringing with deep, undeniable respect. I have never seen a chief executive officer deliver a $200 million operational breakdown entirely from memory. You have a deal. Aegis and Vanguard are officially partners. I shook her hand firmly, cementing the billion-dollar alliance. The adrenaline in the room was palpable. Brittany was practically shrinking into the drywall in the back corner of the room. Her petty, pathetic sabotage had not just failed, it had provided the exact platform I needed to prove my absolute superiority to the most important clients of the quarter. She looked down at the cheap steno pad in her trembling hands, utterly humiliated. She was wearing a discount store uniform, holding a pen like a glorified servant, and was entirely invisible to the elite women she once considered her closest social peers. Victoria picked up her designer briefcase and turned toward the heavy glass doors to exit the boardroom. As she reached for the stainless steel handle, she paused. She turned her head and looked directly at Brittany. Victoria examined my sister from head to toe with a cold, clinical curiosity, taking in the frizzy hair and the defeated posture. Victoria turned back to look at me. "By the way, Simone," Victoria said, adjusting the leather strap of her bag. "Your new junior assistant here. Her father is Richard, correct?" I maintained a perfectly neutral expression and gave a single nod. "That is correct." Victoria let out a dry, humorless chuckle. I thought she looked familiar. "My firm handles the commercial supply chain contracts for his hardware manufacturing company. We just audited his vendor ledgers this morning. He has been defaulting on our invoices for 6 consecutive months. He is completely over-leveraged, and his cash flow is entirely non-existent." Victoria pushed the heavy glass door open, stepping out into the hallway as she delivered the final devastating blow. "We are filing for his corporate bankruptcy tomorrow." The heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing Victoria and Chloe in the hallway and leaving a suffocating vacuum of silence in the boardroom. Brittany stood frozen against the back wall, her knuckles white as she gripped the cheap steno pad. The smug, triumphant sneer had been completely wiped from her face, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a woman watching her entire family dynasty evaporate in real time. Our parents' entire persona, the country club memberships, the luxury cars, the endless bragging about Richard's manufacturing empire, was a meticulously crafted lie. They were broke. I did not give Brittany a single moment to process the destruction of her reality. I turned off the projector and pointed directly to the door. "Return to your cubicle, Brittany. You have another 400 receipts to digitize before you clock out. If I find a single error in your data entry, you will be working through the weekend." She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply lowered her head, her shoulders shaking, and stumbled out of the executive suite like a ghost. I spent the remainder of the afternoon finalizing the Vanguard merger, efficiently locking down a deal that would increase my firm's valuation by billions. By the time I took my private elevator down to the executive parking garage, it was nearly 9 o'clock. A torrential downpour had moved into the city, drumming heavily against the concrete pillars of the underground structure. The air was damp and biting. My driver usually pulled the car around, but tonight I had dismissed him, craving the quiet isolation of the drive home to process the absolute victory of the day. As I approached my sleek black sedan, a shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar near the driver's side door. My hand instinctively moved toward the panic button on my keys, but the figure stepped into the dim overhead lighting, raising both hands in a gesture of surrender. It was Richard. The imposing dictatorial patriarch who had commanded every room he ever entered was entirely gone. He stood shivering in the freezing rain, blowing in from the open garage entrance. His expensive bespoke wool topcoat was completely soaked, clinging heavily to his slumped shoulders. His gray hair was plastered to his forehead, and his leather dress shoes were ruined in a puddle of oily water. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly desperate. He had bypassed building security, likely bribing a guard or slipping in behind a delivery truck just to corner me in the dark. "Simone," he choked out, taking a hesitant step forward. His teeth were audibly chattering. "Please, I need to talk to you. I tried calling your office all afternoon, but your assistants blocked my numbers." I stopped 5 feet away from him, gripping my keys, completely unfazed by his pitiful state. "You are trespassing on private corporate property, Richard. State your business in 60 seconds, or I am calling building security to have you arrested and escorted off the premises in handcuffs." He swallowed hard, his pride completely shattering as he looked up at the daughter he had spent a lifetime degrading. Vanguard called me this afternoon. They terminated my vendor contracts. They are filing the bankruptcy paperwork at dawn tomorrow. They are going to seize the manufacturing plants, the warehouses, the inventory, everything. They are going to take the house, Simone. We are going to lose everything. I am aware, I replied, my voice clinical and completely devoid of sympathy. Victoria Sterling informed me of your massive financial incompetence hours ago. It seems your untouchable hardware empire was nothing but a fragile house of cards propped up by toxic debt you could not service. He squeezed his eyes shut as a fresh gust of freezing rain swept over him. I made some bad investments. The market shifted unexpectedly. I tried to leverage the company assets to cover the margin calls, but the interest rates crushed me. Simone Aegis Financial has billions in capital. You have the liquidity to buy out my debt right now. You can stop Vanguard from liquidating my life's work. You can issue a corporate bailout and save this family from absolute ruin. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate pleading hunger. He was begging. The man who had mocked my ambitions, starved me of affection, and funded my sister's lavish lifestyle while treating me like a servant, was standing in a puddle begging for a fraction of the wealth I had built entirely without him. I looked at him through the freezing rain, my expression hardening into absolute stone. Remember when I asked for $500 for my college textbooks and you said failures don't get funding? You are a failing business, Richard. He flinched violently, stepping backward as if I had physically struck him across the face. The memory hit him undeniably sharp and precise. He had stood in our pristine kitchen, sipping a glass of scotch that cost more than the books I desperately needed, and laughed at my request. He had told me to drop out and find a rich husband because I lacked the intellect for high-level finance. I was trying to teach you independence. He stammered, a pathetic, trembling attempt to rewrite his history of cruelty. I was trying to make you strong so you could survive the real world. You were trying to break me, I corrected, stepping closer so my voice cut cleanly over the sound of the rain. You wanted me weak and dependent, just like Brittany, just like Patricia, so you could maintain absolute control over everyone around you. But your control was a complete illusion funded by phantom money you did not actually have. He dropped his gaze to the wet concrete, unable to meet my eyes. Please, he whispered, a broken, hollow sound. If Vanguard liquidates your mother and I will have nothing, we will literally be on the street by the end of the month. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you equity. Just buy the debt. Please, Simone. I stared at the pathetic shell of my father. This was the moment. This was the transaction that would finalize the shift in power forever. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, waterproof binder. I had my elite acquisitions team run a forensic audit on his hardware company the second Victoria Sterling left my boardroom. I tossed the heavy binder onto the hood of my car. It landed with a loud, wet smack. I will buy your debt from Vanguard first thing tomorrow morning, I stated. Richard let out a massive, shuddering gasp of relief, his knees buckling slightly as he reached out to steady himself against the slick metal of my car. Thank you. Simone, thank you. I promise I will make the company profitable again. I will pay back every single cent with interest. You will not pay back anything, I interrupted smoothly, my tone slicing cleanly through his momentary relief. I am buying the debt, but I am not bailing you out. I am executing a hostile takeover. Aegis Financial will assume total ownership of your hardware company. You will forfeit all executive control. You will step down as CEO immediately, and you will sign over the deed to the suburban estate to cover the remaining equity deficit. You work for me now, and your salary will be strictly minimum wage until your debt to me is cleared. His jaw dropped open. The relief instantly transformed into absolute paralyzing horror. You cannot do that. That is my company. I built it from the ground up. You are stealing everything I have. I am saving you from federal bankruptcy court, I countered, tapping the heavy binder on the hood. And frankly, you should be getting down on your knees and thanking me. My auditors found something extremely interesting while reviewing your ledgers this afternoon. Something Vanguard missed in their initial sweep. Richard froze. The rain continued to pour, but he suddenly looked as though he had stopped breathing entirely. Your company has been hemorrhaging cash for 3 years, I said, opening the binder to a specific highlighted page. But it was not all bad investments or market shifts. There is a highly systematic recurring wire transfer buried deep in your accounts payable. $200,000 routed through a shell company completely unaccounted for in your operational budget. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. I tapped the highlighted line item with my manicured finger. Who is PW Accounts? Dad. Richard wiped the freezing rain from his eyes, his shaking fingers leaving streaks of grime across his pale face. He leaned closer to the hood of my car, squinting at the highlighted line item in the waterproof binder. The confusion radiating from him was entirely genuine. It is a materials vendor. Richard stammered, his teeth clicking together in the biting cold. Pacific Wholesale. They supply the raw steel and industrial fasteners for the manufacturing plants in the Midwest. I stared at him for a long, silent moment. The absolute certainty in his voice was pathetic. I picked up the binder and turned toward the private elevator bay. "We are going upstairs," I commanded, not looking back to see if he was following. "You are dripping freezing water on my car, and you are about to require a chair." Richard trailed behind me like a beaten dog. The high-speed elevator shot us up to the executive penthouse in total silence. When the polished steel doors parted, I led him through the glass corridor and into my CEO suite. The room was warm, quiet, and aggressively intimidating. My security detail immediately handed Richard a thick microfiber towel, silently instructing him to stand on the entryway tile so his ruined leather shoes would not destroy my custom-imported rugs. I walked behind my massive desk and woke up my primary monitor. With a few swift keystrokes, I bypassed his company's basic security firewalls and pulled his internal corporate ledgers onto the massive wall-mounted flat screen for him to see. Pacific Wholesale filed for Chapter 11. Bankruptcy and completely dissolved their corporate entity 6 years ago, I stated, my voice echoing in the cavernous office. I cross-referenced the routing numbers attached to this specific account. The funds are not going to a steel distributor in the Midwest. They are being routed through a digital shell company based in the Cayman Islands before being automatically deposited into a private domestic checking account. Richard clutched the microfiber towel, water dripping from his gray hair onto the collar of his ruined topcoat. "I do not understand," he whispered. "Who authorized this?" "Your chief financial officer authorized the initial vendor account," I explained smoothly. "But the recurring wire transfers were manually approved every single quarter by the only other person who holds executive signature privileges on your corporate accounts." I pressed a key, and the digital routing trail expanded on the screen, linking the offshore shell company to a joint checking account at a local high-end bank. "PW Accounts does not stand for Pacific Wholesale, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. "PW stands for Patricia, your wife." The color vanished from his face so quickly I thought he might actually collapse. He grabbed the back of a leather guest chair to steady himself. "That is impossible," he choked out. "Patricia does not know the first thing about corporate accounting. She barely knows how to log into the online banking portal. She knows exactly how to siphon $200,000 of working capital out of your business every fiscal year," I countered, highlighting the withdrawal column. "My auditors pulled the expense reports from Patricia's hidden account. Would you like to know where your missing operational budget went?" I did not wait for his answer. I began reading the expenses directly from the screen. $30,000 a year to cover the mortgage on Brittany's luxury downtown loft. $45,000 a year to lease Malik's imported sports cars. Another $50,000 funneled directly into Malik's digital trading accounts, so he could maintain his fake glamorous image as a cryptocurrency genius. Your wife has been systematically bleeding your hardware company dry for 4 years to fund your golden daughter's lifestyle. Richard let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. His knees finally buckled and he collapsed heavily into the leather chair, completely ignoring the fact that his wet coat was soaking the expensive upholstery. The golden family illusion he had worshipped his entire life shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. The profound, agonizing realization washed over his features. He had sacrificed his business, his retirement, and his relationship with his youngest daughter to prop up a wife and eldest child who were actively robbing him blind. He buried his face in his trembling hands. The dictatorial patriarch was dead. "You starved my college fund to teach me a lesson about independence," I noted, my tone completely devoid of pity. "You told me failures do not get funding. Meanwhile, your wife embezzled your operational budget to buy Brittany designer handbags, and your son-in-law gambled away your house." I pulled a fresh, crisp legal contract from my desk drawer and slid it across the mahogany surface. I placed a silver pen exactly an inch from his shaking fingers. "I am buying the debt from Vanguard," I stated, stepping back to watch him. "Aegis Financial Analytics will assume total ownership of your hardware company. You are stepping down as CEO immediately. You will sign over the deed to the suburban estate to cover the remaining equity deficit, and you will retain a position as a regional manager at minimum wage until your debt to this firm is cleared. Sign it." Richard did not argue. He did not protest the hostile takeover of his life's work. He picked up the pen and signed his name, officially becoming my employee. He was a broken, empty man. I signaled my security guards, who immediately stepped forward to escort him out of the building. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind my father, I sat down in my leather chair. The hardware company was mine, and the suburban house was mine. But I wanted absolute, undeniable leverage before the final hammer dropped on my mother. I needed to ensure Patricia had not hidden any other financial landmines that could attach liability to the suburban estate I had just acquired. I opened a secure, encrypted background check software utilized by my top-tier acquisitions team. I typed in Patricia's full legal name, her maiden name, and her social security number. I initiated a deep dive forensic scan of her entire financial footprint, spanning the last decade. The software hummed, aggregating credit reports, banking histories, and digital footprints. Minutes later, the results populated on my screen. I scrolled past the joint accounts she shared with Richard and the hidden account she used for the embezzlement. Then a massive, glaring red flag flashed across my terminal. It was an active, highly leveraged line of credit with a major national bank. The account had a staggering balance maxed out to the absolute limit, with a history of late payments and aggressive penalty fees. But the red flag was not the debt itself, it was the name on the account. The credit card was not in Patricia's name. I leaned closer to the monitor, my blood turning to absolute ice. The account was opened exactly 8 years ago, during the exact month I had been forced to move out of their house and sleep in my car to attend college. The billing address was a private post office box registered to my mother. But the name on the active credit card and the social security number used to illegally secure the massive line of credit belonged to Simone. Patricia had not just embezzled from her husband. My mother had committed felony identity theft, using my social security number, deliberately destroying my financial future while I was struggling to survive. I stared at the glowing screen, the sheer audacity of the crime burning away any lingering microscopic shred of familial obligation I might have subconsciously held. My own mother had weaponized my identity. She had stolen my future to buy designer shoes and fund country club lunches while I was eating instant noodles in a freezing college dorm room. I did not shed a single tear. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute resolve. I picked up the sleek desk phone and dialed my head of security. "Bring Patricia up to the penthouse immediately," I ordered. "She is waiting in the ground floor lobby for Richard. Escort her directly into my office." Less than 3 minutes later, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Patricia marched into the room, radiating a toxic, misplaced arrogance. She was wearing a pristine Chanel suit, undoubtedly purchased with stolen funds, and clutching a crocodile leather handbag. Her chin was tilted up, ready to deliver her usual scathing lecture. Then she saw Richard. He was still slumped in the leather guest chair, soaked to the bone, staring blankly at his ruined shoes. "What on earth have you done to your father, Simone?" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the expansive suite. "You always were a vindictive, ungrateful girl. I demand you apologize to him right now and explain why he is sitting here looking like a vagrant." I ignored her theatrical outrage entirely. I pressed a single key on my console, replacing Richard's ruined corporate ledgers on the massive wall-mounted monitor with a high-resolution scan of Patricia's hidden credit card statements. $80,000, Patricia. I stated, my voice slicing through her performance like a scalpel. Patricia froze. Her eyes darted to the massive screen. She recognized the banking logo, the itemized lists of luxury purchases, and the staggering final balance immediately. The arrogant flush vanished from her cheeks, replaced by a sickly, chalky pallor. She swallowed hard, her manicured fingers tightening around her expensive handbag. "I have no idea what you are displaying," she stammered, attempting a weak, dismissive laugh. "If your father has been mismanaging a family line of credit, you need to take that up with him. I handle the household affairs, not the banking." "Do not insult my intelligence," I replied smoothly, leaning forward and resting my arms on the polished desk. "Richard did not open this account. You did. You secured an elite-tier credit card using my exact name, my date of birth, and my social security number. You routed the billing statements to a private post office box completely untraceable to this family. You committed federal identity theft to fund Brittany's lavish apartment, Malik's customized car rims, and your own cosmetic dermatology appointments." Richard slowly lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his wife. "You stole her identity," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "You told me her credit was ruined because she was financially irresponsible. You told me she was failing." Patricia realized her husband was useless. She realized the undeniable digital evidence was staring her in the face. With her back against the wall, she abandoned the denial and pivoted instantly to the most toxic, narcissistic defense imaginable. She squared her shoulders, her eyes flashing with indignant rage. "So what if I did?" Patricia snarled, stepping closer to my desk. "I gave birth to you, I clothed you, I fed you, and I put a roof over your head for 18 years. Your credit score belongs to me. You owe me everything you have. Using your name to maintain our family's social standing was the absolute least you could do to repay the endless sacrifices I made for your ungrateful, miserable existence." Her twisted logic hung in the air, a stunning testament to her absolute delusion. She genuinely believed that giving birth to me granted her the perpetual right to sabotage my life. She expected me to argue. She wanted a screaming match, a dramatic daughter and mother fight where she could play the victim and manipulate the narrative to make me feel small. I did not give her the satisfaction of a single raised voice. I reached out and pressed the speakerphone button on my primary console. I dialed the Direct Fraud Division hotline for the National Bank displayed on the screen. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice echoed through my office. "National Bank Elite Fraud Division, this is Agent Miller speaking. How can I assist you today?" Patricia stopped breathing. Her eyes widened in absolute terror as she realized what was happening. "Hello, Agent Miller?" I said, my voice perfectly level and calm. "My name is Simone. I am calling to report $80,000 in fraudulent charges and a stolen identity. I have the exact IP addresses used to open the account, the private post office box routing numbers, and the digital signatures on file." "Simone, hang that up right now," Patricia hissed, lunging forward across the desk to grab the phone. My security guards moved faster. Two massive men in tailored suits stepped out from the shadows, grabbing Patricia by the arms and hauling her backward. She struggled violently, her expensive handbag hitting the floor, but they held her firmly in place. "I have the perpetrator in my office right now." I continued, speaking clearly to the bank agent over the sound of my mother's struggling. "Her name is Patricia. She used my social security number to open the account 8 years ago. I am authorizing a complete lock on the account and requesting an immediate federal fraud investigation." "Understood," the agent replied efficiently. "We are locking the account immediately. Given the monetary value, this constitutes felony fraud. We will be dispatching our investigative findings to federal authorities." "Thank you," I said, and ended the call. The dial tone echoed in the silent room. Patricia was hyperventilating, struggling fruitlessly against the security guards. "You cannot do this to your own mother. I will go to jail. They will lock me up in federal prison. You are destroying your own family." "You destroyed this family the day you decided my future was a slush fund for your vanity?" I replied, standing up and buttoning my blazer. You should have considered federal sentencing guidelines before you decided my credit score belonged to you. Richard, do something, Patricia screamed, looking at her husband. Tell her to stop this. Richard simply lowered his head back into his hands, completely broken. He had nothing left to offer. He was a ruined man watching his criminal wife face the exact consequences she had spent a decade earning. I walked out from behind my desk and stood directly in front of Patricia. She was trembling, her expensive makeup running down her cheeks, the illusion of the perfect suburban matriarch entirely shattered. I am not the one sending you to prison, Patricia, I said quietly. I just made the phone call. You built this cage yourself. As I finished speaking, the heavy glass doors leading into the executive suite lobby slid open. The timing was absolutely flawless. I had tipped off the local authorities the moment my auditors found the credit file, long before Patricia even stepped onto the elevator. Two uniformed police officers strode onto the polished tile, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. They surveyed the room, taking in Richard's defeated posture and the security guards restraining my mother. The lead officer stepped forward, his gaze locking directly onto the frantic, sobbing woman in the Chanel suit. We received a priority call regarding a felony identity theft and credit fraud in progress. The officer stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Are you Patricia? The lead officer's hand hovered over the metallic handcuffs clipped to his belt. The heavy, unmistakable clink of the steel chains echoed in the dead silence of my executive suite. Patricia did not sneer. She did not raise her chin. Her pristine Chanel suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume as her knees gave out completely. She collapsed onto the imported rug, the illusion of her elite, untouchable suburban supremacy shattering into dust. She looked up at me, her face streaked with black mascara, her eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. Simone, she gasped, reaching out a trembling hand toward the hem of my skirt. Please, I am your mother. You cannot let them put me in a cage. I will not survive it. Please. I looked down at her. I felt no triumph, no pity, and absolutely no hesitation. I turned my attention to the two police officers standing at attention. Officers, I am the reporting party and the victim of the identity theft. I said, my voice projecting crisp, absolute authority. I am willing to pursue a comprehensive civil restitution agreement before formalizing the criminal charges. I require exactly 10 minutes with the perpetrator in my private boardroom. If she refuses my terms, you may escort her out in irons. The officers exchanged a brief look, noting the sheer scale of the executive penthouse and the presence of my armed security detail. The lead officer gave a single firm nod. We will wait right outside these glass doors, ma'am. 10 minutes. I signaled my security chief. Bring her into the boardroom and send someone down to the basement archives. Drag Brittany upstairs immediately. 2 minutes later, the grand mahogany doors of the primary boardroom sealed shut. The ambient lighting cast a cold, clinical glow over the massive, polished table. I took my seat at the absolute head of the table, the undisputed monarch of the empire I had built with my own hands. The tableau in front of me was a masterpiece of total destruction. Richard sat to my left, shivering violently in his soaked wool coat, a bankrupt, defeated shell of a patriarch. Patricia sat directly across from me, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, facing a lengthy federal prison sentence. Brittany had just been shoved into the room by my security team. Her hair was frizzy, her discount store uniform was stained with archive dust, and her eyes darted frantically around the room as she absorbed the horrifying reality of her parents' ruin. Malik was notably absent, likely dodging the loan sharks holding the paper on his crippling, insurmountable crypto debts. The Golden family was dead. They had spent decades actively bleeding each other dry, hiding behind country club memberships and leased luxury cars, all while treating me like dirt beneath their shoes. Now they were entirely at my mercy. I slid a thick, impeccably bound legal document across the center of the mahogany table. It stopped precisely equidistant between the three of them. This is a master buyout agreement, I announced, my voice cutting through Patricia's pathetic weeping. My legal team drafted it 30 minutes ago. It contains the only lifeline any of you will ever receive. Brittany stared at the document, her hands shaking. What is that? What are you making them do, Simone? I shifted my gaze to my older sister, locking onto her terrified eyes. I am offering a master contract to save all of your pathetic lives. First, I will personally pay off the $80,000 fraudulent credit card balance, and I will formally withdraw my federal identity theft complaint. That keeps you out of a federal penitentiary, Patricia. Patricia let out a loud, gasping sob of relief, reaching for the document. I slammed my hand flat against the table, stopping her instantly. I was not finished. Second, I continued, my tone lowering to a lethal register. I will purchase Richard's toxic debt from Vanguard, halting the liquidation of the hardware company and keeping you out of bankruptcy court tomorrow morning. Third, and perhaps most importantly, I will permanently bury the forensic accounting ledgers, proving that Brittany knowingly received hundreds of thousands of dollars in embezzled corporate funds to pay for her luxury loft and Malik's leased sports cars. Brittany flinched as if I had shot her. Her jaw dropped open. I did not know it was embezzled. Mom said it was from a family trust. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense for receiving stolen corporate funds. Brittany, I stated coldly. The federal prosecutors would gladly charge you as an accessory to embezzlement. Signing this document is the only thing keeping you from wearing a matching orange jumpsuit right next to our mother. Richard leaned forward, his hands trembling as he hovered over the thick stack of paper. What is the price, Simone? What do you want from us? I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers together. I want the crown jewel. I want the single remaining asset that validates your entire fake, pretentious existence. The deed to the suburban estate must be signed over to my corporate trust. Irrevocably, tonight. You will forfeit all legal ownership of the family mansion. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The estate was their ultimate status symbol. It was the house where they had hosted lavish parties, the house where they had mocked my ambitions, the house that proved they were better than everyone else. Giving it up meant admitting to the entire world that they were absolute, undeniable frauds. We will have nowhere to live, Patricia wailed, her voice cracking with sheer panic. You are throwing your own parents out on the street. You can rent a modest apartment using the minimum wage salary Richard will be earning in my warehouse, I replied, my expression carved from ice. Or you can refuse the contract. Keep the house and the bank will foreclose on it while you sit in a federal holding cell. The police officers are waiting right outside that glass door. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide. I picked up a heavy silver fountain pen and tossed it onto the center of the master contract. There was no debate. There was no alternate strategy. They were completely cornered, outplayed, and outmatched by the daughter they had actively tried to destroy. Richard grabbed the pen first. His hand shook so violently he could barely hold it steady, but he scratched his signature onto the bottom line. He pushed the document toward Patricia. She squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears ruining the last of her expensive makeup, and signed her name officially, surrendering her kingdom to save her own skin. Brittany grabbed the pen last, scribbling her signature with frantic, terrified speed. The ink was barely dry on the heavy paper. The absolute transfer of power was complete. I reached out and pulled the master contract across the table, closing the leather binder with a sharp, decisive snap. Before anyone could utter a single word, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. My chief of security marched into the boardroom, his face set in a grim, urgent expression. He bypassed my family entirely, walking straight to the head of the table and leaning down to my ear. Ma'am, the security chief said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. Malik just emptied his wife's joint checking account. He abandoned his leased vehicles at the terminal and is currently at the airport trying to board a one-way flight to Dubai. He did what Brittany gasped, the color draining entirely from her face. She frantically dug into her cheap discount store uniform pocket, pulling out her cracked smartphone. Her trembling thumbs pulled up her banking application. The screen glowed harshly in the dim boardroom, reflecting the absolute terror in her wide eyes. $0. He had taken every single cent, including her meager paycheck, from the week, leaving her entirely responsible for the massive cascading avalanche of toxic debt he had accumulated in her name. He left me, she whispered, her voice cracking as the phone slipped from her fingers and clattered loudly onto the polished mahogany table. He took the money, and he left me to take the fall. I did not flinch. I had anticipated Malik's cowardice the exact moment my elite auditors uncovered his fraudulent cryptocurrency ledgers. A rat will always abandon a sinking ship, but I owned the ocean he was trying to sail across. Call Intercept Team Alpha. I commanded my security chief, not breaking eye contact with my sister. Put the feed on the primary monitor. I want everyone in this room to watch exactly how the golden illusion ends. My security chief tapped his earpiece, speaking in rapid, clipped alphanumeric codes. On the massive wall-mounted screen, the corporate ledgers and identity theft evidence vanished, replaced instantly by a live high-definition security feed hacked directly from the international departure terminal at the airport. There he was, Malik. He was wearing designer sunglasses indoors, a bespoke silk suit, and clutching a heavy leather duffel bag that likely contained the last of Brittany's stolen cash. He was standing in the priority boarding lane, nervously checking his diamond-encrusted watch, inches away from handing his first-class ticket to the gate agent. Zoom in on the gate number, I instructed. The camera feed magnified, focusing on the glowing blue digital sign hovering directly above Malik's head. Gate 24. A cold, sharp smile finally broke across my face. The universe possessed a phenomenal, ruthless sense of humor. Gate 24, I said aloud, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom. Do you recognize that terminal, Patricia Richard? My parents stared at the screen in mute, paralyzed horror. 10 years ago, I continued my tone, dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. You booked a luxury family vacation to the Maldives. You packed your custom luggage, loaded Brittany and Malik into the first-class cabin, and handed me the keys to the house at that exact gate. You told me I was not socially fit to accompany you. You abandoned me at gate 24 with a list of chores and told me to take the public bus back to the suburbs to babysit the dogs while you enjoyed paradise. I stepped around the mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the tile. Malik is not getting on that plane, I stated. On the live feed, Malik handed his thick navy blue passport to the gate agent. He flashed his signature arrogant smile, expecting to be ushered onto the luxury jet. Instead, the agent scanned the passport, frowned, and stepped backward, signaling someone off camera. Suddenly, the feed erupted into chaos. 4 men in dark conservative suits stepped out of the boarding bridge. They were not airport security. They were senior litigation partners from Aegis Financial, accompanied directly by 3 armed federal agents wearing tactical vests. What is happening? Brittany shrieked, clutching the edge of the table as she watched her husband frantically back away from the gate counter. Yesterday morning, I executed a hostile buyout of Apex Trading, the corporate shell company Malik used to launder his fake cryptocurrency investments, I explained, watching the screen with clinical satisfaction. That makes me his primary indisputable creditor. He owes my firm $4 million. Attempting to flee the country to a non-extradition territory while under active federal investigation for wire fraud is a severe federal crime. On the monitor, Malik dropped his leather duffel bag. He raised his hands, arguing violently with the federal agents. He pointed at his chest, puffing himself up, trying to leverage the fake billionaire persona he had maintained for years. The lead federal agent did not hesitate. He grabbed Malik by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed him face first into the departure desk. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping around Malik's wrists was not audible through the silent feed, but the visual was absolutely undeniable. His designer sunglasses clattered to the airport floor, crushed instantly beneath the heavy boot of a federal agent. The agent confiscated his passport, sealing it inside a clear plastic evidence bag. He was not flying to Dubai. He was going to a federal holding cell. My security chief tapped a key, freezing the frame on Malik's horrified, tear-stained face, as he was walked away from gate 24. Turn it off, I commanded. The screen went entirely black, plunging the boardroom back into heavy, oppressive silence. I looked at the 3 of them. Richard was staring at the blank screen, his jaw hanging loose, completely unable to process the destruction of his legacy. Patricia was hyperventilating, her hands clawing at her expensive Chanel skirt, her impending prison sentence looming over her. Brittany looked as though she had been physically hollowed out. "The buyout is complete," I announced, adjusting the cuffs of my immaculate blazer. "The corporate transition takes effect immediately. Security will escort you to the ground floor lobby. You no longer have clearance for the executive suites. You do not belong here." I did not wait for their response. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving my highly trained security team to herd the shattered remnants of my family toward the service elevator. I took my private lift down to the primary corporate lobby, intending to speak with my reception staff about revoking their building access permanently. The lobby of Aegis Financial was a sprawling, immaculate expanse of white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. High above the reception desk, a bank of massive plasma televisions continuously broadcast global financial news. As the service elevator doors opened and my security team marched Richard, Patricia, and Brittany into the lobby, the breaking news alert flashed across the screens. The local media had already intercepted the airport arrest. Malik's face, captured by a reporter's smartphone, was plastered across every single television in the room. The glowing red ticker at the bottom of the screen read in bold, unforgiving letters: "Local tech entrepreneur arrested at Gate 24 for massive corporate fraud." Brittany stopped dead in the center of the lobby. Her cheap uniform hung loosely on her frame. The reality of her entire existence finally crashed down upon her. She had no husband. She had no money. She had no luxury loft, no sports cars, and no golden child status to hide behind. Her husband had left her holding the bag for millions in criminal debt. She was entirely bankrupt, utterly humiliated, and completely alone. She slowly turned her head and saw me standing near the reception desk, surrounded by my loyal executives. A guttural, agonizing sob ripped from her throat. Her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the cold, white marble of the corporate lobby, crawling forward on her hands and knees. Everyone in the building, analysts, clients, and executives, stopped to stare as the former golden daughter dragged herself across the floor. She lunged forward, wrapping her arms desperately around my legs, burying her tear-streaked face against my skirt. "Simone," she wailed, her voice echoing painfully off the glass walls. "Simone, please, I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing. You have to save me. Please, I am begging you. Do not let them take me." I stared down at the pathetic, writhing spectacle unfolding on the pristine white marble of my corporate lobby. Brittany dug her acrylic nails into the fabric of my skirt, her tears leaving dark, wet streaks across the immaculate material. The entire ground floor had ground to an absolute halt. Junior analysts, senior vice presidents, and wealthy clients stood frozen in their tracks, watching the former golden child of the hardware empire reduce herself to a groveling, hysterical mess. "I am so sorry," Simone Brittany choked out, her face pressed against my knees. "I am sorry for everything. I am sorry I laughed when Mom cut off your college tuition. I am sorry I paraded my sports cars in front of your apartment when you could barely afford groceries. I am sorry I took the corporate money I did not know Malik was going to leave me. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt in my name, and I do not even have a bank account left to buy lunch today. Please, you are my sister. You have to fix this." I did not move a single muscle. I let her weep. I let the absolute crushing weight of her public humiliation settle over the lobby. A few feet away, my security team was actively dragging Richard and Patricia toward the revolving glass exit doors. Patricia was clawing at the air, trying to reach her precious eldest daughter, screaming my name in a hoarse, ragged voice. "Let her go!" Patricia shrieked, fighting against the massive security guard gripping her upper arms. "Simone, she is your flesh and blood. You cannot leave her like this." The heavy glass doors slid shut, cutting off my mother's frantic screaming entirely. I watched through the transparent panels as Richard stumbled out onto the concrete pavement, looking completely disoriented, while Patricia collapsed against a concrete pillar. They were officially locked out of my fortress. They could not save Brittany. They could not even save themselves. I slowly reached down and firmly detached Brittany's trembling fingers from my skirt. I stepped back, forcing her to fall forward onto her hands. She looked up at me, her face blotchy, her breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. She was waiting for a lifeline. She was waiting for the unconditional bailout she had received every single time she had manufactured a crisis in her entirely pampered life. "I don't need your apology, Brittany," I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the silent marble lobby. "I just needed you to understand what reality feels like. Now get back to your cubicle, those files won't sort themselves." I turned my back on her without another word. I signaled my security chief with a sharp nod, instructing him to ensure she returned to her basement archive desk immediately. I walked gracefully toward my private elevator, the rhythmic click of my heels breaking the silence of the room. I did not look back, as the polished steel doors slid shut, sealing me inside my ascending sanctuary, while Brittany's renewed sobbing echoed through the ground floor 3 months later. The bitter autumn wind swept through the immaculate, sprawling grounds of the suburban estate, rustling the vibrant orange leaves of the ancient oak trees. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand dining room, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, watching my private landscaping team meticulously trim the hedges lining the stone driveway. A tremendous amount of corporate and personal restructuring had occurred over the past 90 days. The transfer of power was absolute and undeniable. Richard was currently wearing a blue canvas vest with a plastic name tag, working a minimum wage shift at one of my regional hardware distribution warehouses. My floor managers reported that he arrived exactly 10 minutes early every single day, absolutely terrified of losing the only meager income keeping him and his wife off the streets. Patricia was living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city, learning how to navigate public transportation because her luxury SUV had been immediately repossessed by my aggressive acquisitions team. Malik was sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility without bail, awaiting a massive wire fraud trial that would undoubtedly result in a lengthy prison sentence. And Brittany was clocking into the windowless basement archives of Aegis Financial every single morning at exactly 8 o'clock. She spent her days covered in dust, organizing thousands of paper files under the strict, unforgiving supervision of a floor manager who did not care about her past social standing. I garnished exactly 80% of her wages to slowly pay down the massive mountain of criminal debt her husband had abandoned her with. She was exhausted, silent, and entirely broken. I walked away from his window and approached the massive mahogany dining table. I had spent the last 2 months completely gutting and renovating the interior of the house, stripping away every ounce of Patricia's tacky, pretentious decor. The surface of the new table was polished to a mirror finish, stretching majestically across the cavernous room. At the very head of the table sat a stack of heavy cream-colored cardstock envelopes. Thanksgiving was exactly 2 weeks away. For my entire life, this specific holiday had been a heavily weaponized event. Patricia and Richard had used Thanksgiving to showcase their immense wealth to the extended family, hosting lavish catered dinners in this exact room. They had historically seated me at the furthest end of the table, loudly dismissing my achievements, mocking my financial independence, and forcing me to watch them shower Brittany and Malik with praise and wildly expensive gifts. It was their annual performance of supreme dominance. This year, the performance belonged entirely to me. I picked up one of the heavy envelopes, running my thumb over the gold foil embossing. I had meticulously curated the guest list. I invited every single aunt, uncle, and distant cousin who had ever sat at this table and laughed at my expense. I invited the wealthy suburban neighbors Patricia used to desperately try to impress. And of course, I mailed formal mandatory invitations to Richard, Patricia, and Brittany. I slid the thick invitation out of the envelope to inspect the precise, elegant calligraphy. The text formally requested their presence for a grand Thanksgiving feast. The location printed at the bottom of the card was the exact address of the sprawling, luxurious family mansion. The ultimate crushing twist was printed right at the top. The extended family, the neighbors, and my ruined parents were not being invited to the matriarch's house. They were being summoned to mine. I owned the estate, I held the deed. I was the master of the house, and they were about to eat a holiday dinner, completely funded, hosted, and controlled by the daughter they had thrown away. Fast forward 3 months. The bitter autumn wind swept through the immaculate, sprawling grounds of the suburban estate, rustling the vibrant orange leaves of the ancient oak trees. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand dining room, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, watching my private landscaping team meticulously trim the hedges lining the stone driveway. A tremendous amount of corporate and personal restructuring had occurred over the past 90 days. The transfer of power was absolute and undeniable. Richard was currently wearing a blue canvas vest with a plastic name tag, working a minimum wage shift at one of my regional hardware distribution warehouses. My floor managers reported that he arrived exactly 10 minutes early every single day, absolutely terrified of losing the only meager income keeping him and his wife off the streets. Patricia was living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city, learning how to navigate public transportation because her luxury SUV had been immediately repossessed by my aggressive acquisitions team. Malik was sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility without bail, awaiting a massive wire fraud trial that would undoubtedly result in a lengthy prison sentence. And Brittany was clocking into the windowless basement archives of Aegis Financial every single morning at exactly 8 o'clock. She spent her days covered in dust, organizing thousands of paper files, under the strict, unforgiving supervision of a floor manager who did not care about her past social standing. I garnished exactly 80% of her wages to slowly pay down the massive mountain of criminal debt her husband had abandoned her with. She was exhausted, silent, and entirely broken. I walked away from the window and approached the massive mahogany dining table. I had spent the last 2 months completely gutting and renovating the interior of the house, stripping away every ounce of Patricia's tacky, pretentious decor. The surface of the new table was polished to a mirror finish, stretching majestically across the cavernous room. At the very head of the table sat a stack of heavy cream-colored cardstock envelopes. Thanksgiving was exactly 2 weeks away. For my entire life, this specific holiday had been a heavily weaponized event. Patricia and Richard had used Thanksgiving to showcase their immense wealth to the extended family, hosting lavish catered dinners in this exact room. They had historically seated me at the furthest end of the table, loudly dismissing my achievements, mocking my financial independence, and forcing me to watch them shower Brittany and Malik with praise and wildly expensive gifts. It was their annual performance of supreme dominance. This year, the performance belonged entirely to me. I picked up one of the heavy envelopes, running my thumb over the gold foil embossing. I had meticulously curated the guest list. I invited every single aunt, uncle, and distant cousin who had ever sat at this table and laughed at my expense. I invited the wealthy suburban neighbors Patricia used to desperately try to impress. And of course, I mailed formal mandatory invitations to Richard, Patricia, and Brittany. I slid the thick invitation out of the envelope to inspect the precise, elegant calligraphy. The text formally requested their presence for a grand Thanksgiving feast. The location printed at the bottom of the card was the exact address of the sprawling, luxurious family mansion. The ultimate crushing twist was printed right at the top. The extended family, the neighbors, and my ruined parents were not being invited to the matriarch's house. They were being summoned to mine. I owned the estate. I held the deed. I was the master of the house, and they were about to eat a holiday dinner completely funded, hosted, and controlled by the daughter they had thrown away. Thanksgiving evening arrived with a biting chill. I stood in the grand foyer wearing a bespoke tailored dress that cost more than Richard currently made in a year, welcoming my guests. The extended family flowed through the double doors. They were immediately struck silent by the transformation. I had erased Patricia completely. The heavy, oppressive velvet drapes and gaudy gold leaf mirrors she had hoarded were gone. In their place, my interior designers had installed sleek gallery-style lighting, minimalist contemporary art, and clean architectural furniture. It was sophisticated, intimidating, and entirely mine. At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell chimed with a hollow, hesitant ring. My private butler opened the door. Richard, Patricia, and Brittany stood on the freezing porch. They looked entirely out of place. Richard wore a faded suit that had seen better days. Patricia clutched a cheap canvas handbag, her posture hunched, the arrogant matriarch replaced by a terrified, impoverished tenant. Brittany just stared at the marble floor, her eyes hollow and dark. "Come in," I instructed smoothly, waving them toward the dining room. "Dinner is about to be served." They shuffled inside, stripping off their thin coats. Patricia looked up at the vaulted ceiling, her eyes darting around the completely renovated foyer. I watched her throat work as she swallowed hard. Her entire legacy, the visual proof of her fabricated superiority, had been wiped from existence in less than 60 days. She did not say a single word. She just kept her head down and followed the rest of the guests. The dining room was a masterpiece of culinary execution. My private executive chef and his staff seamlessly poured vintage wine and arranged plates of perfectly roasted turkey truffle mashed potatoes and artisanal side dishes. I took my seat at the absolute head of the mahogany table. This was Richard's former throne. He stopped for a fraction of a second, his eyes locking onto me sitting in his chair, before he silently pulled out a standard guest chair near the middle of the table and sat down. Patricia and Brittany flanked him. The dynamic reversal was staggering. For my entire life, this table had been a tribunal where I was the primary target. Now the extended family and the wealthy neighbors completely ignored my parents. Aunt Martha, who used to mock my community college degree, spent the entire first course praising the phenomenal success of Aegis Financial. Uncle Greg asked if I had any open positions for his son. The neighbors practically tripped over themselves complimenting the breathtaking redesign of the estate. I engaged them all with effortless, polished grace. I held court. I poured the wine, directed the conversation, and commanded the absolute respect of every single person in the room. And the three of them just sat there. Richard ate his food methodically, chewing in silence, staring blankly at his silver fork. Patricia barely touched her plate. She kept her hands tightly folded in her lap, shrinking into her chair as the relatives who used to fawn over her now treated her like an invisible, mildly embarrassing charity case. Brittany pushed a piece of turkey around her plate, her eyes wide and vacant, the crushing reality of Malik's abandonment and her insurmountable debt clearly playing on a loop in her mind. There was no yelling. There were no toxic passive-aggressive remarks about my hair, my job, or my lack of a husband. The dictatorial patriarch, the narcissistic mother, and the entitled golden child had absolutely nothing left to say. The silence of their defeated egos was deafening. It was more satisfying than any screaming match could ever be. I was watching them eat the food I paid for in the house I owned, surrounded by people who only respected power. By 9 o'clock, the extended family and neighbors had finished their extravagant desserts and begun to filter out of the house. They shook my hand, thanked me profusely for the extraordinary evening, and quickly bypassed Richard and Patricia without making eye contact. They knew the power had shifted, and they had immediately aligned themselves with the victor. When the heavy front doors finally clicked shut behind the last neighbor, the house fell into a profound, heavy stillness. My service staff quietly cleared the fine china and crystal glasses, disappearing into the kitchen and leaving me entirely alone with my family. I remained seated at the head of the long mahogany table, swirling the last half-inch of deep red wine in my glass. Richard, Patricia, and Brittany had not moved. They sat frozen in their chairs, surrounded by the remnants of the holiday feast. The ambient gallery lighting cast sharp, unforgiving shadows across their exhausted faces. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the absolute crushing finality of their situation. Richard slowly placed his linen napkin on the polished wood. His hands were weathered, calloused from weeks of pulling warehouse shifts. He looked up the length of the table, his eyes meeting mine. The fight had been entirely drained out of him. He was a man who had traded his soul for a facade that no longer existed. "What happens to us now, Simone?" Richard quietly asked, his voice barely a quiet, gravelly whisper. Patricia let out a soft, shuddering breath, her eyes darting toward me with naked, pathetic terror. Brittany did not even blink, just staring blankly at the center of the table, waiting for the executioner to drop the final axe. I set my wine glass down. The sharp clink of the crystal against the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I reached into the sleek leather portfolio resting beside my chair. I pulled out 3 thick sealed manila envelopes. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at the 3 strangers sitting at my dining table, feeling absolutely nothing for them. I leaned forward and slid the 3 manila envelopes firmly across the pristine mahogany surface. They glided perfectly, coming to a halt directly in front of Richard, Patricia, and Brittany. I am selling this house tomorrow, I stated, my voice echoing with lethal absolute authority. Here are your new life assignments. Richard's hands trembled violently as he reached out and broke the heavy wax seal on the thick envelope bearing his and Patricia's names. He pulled out a stack of dense, legally binding documents. I watched with absolute clinical detachment as his eyes scanned the first page. It is a standard lease agreement for a very modest 2-bedroom apartment located in the industrial district on the far east side of the city. I informed them, my voice slicing effortlessly through the heavy, oppressive silence of the dining room. I have prepaid the rent for exactly 12 months. You have 1 year of guaranteed shelter. After that, you are entirely responsible for your own survival. Patricia gasped, dropping the lease as if the paper itself had burned her fingers. She stared blindly at the address printed at the top of the page. It was a neighborhood she had spent her entire adult life mocking during her lavish country club luncheons. Turn to the next page, I instructed Richard. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and flipped the heavy parchment. Staring back at him were 2 standard employee contracts. Those are your new roles for Aegis Financial's Regional Logistics Division, I explained, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. Not executive board positions. Not senior management. You are now entry-level inventory warehouse associates. You will be sorting, lifting, and scanning heavy freight alongside the men and women you spent your entire lives looking down upon. You will clock in at 6 in the morning. You will wear a high-visibility vest. You will take your designated 30-minute lunch breaks. Your minimum wage earnings will be automatically garnished by my accounting department to begin paying back the massive corporate debt you accumulated while desperately trying to maintain your fraudulent empire. Brittany frantically tore open her own envelope, her acrylic nails snapping against the thick paper. She pulled out a single corporate transfer directive. Her face drained of whatever minimal color it had left, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Cleveland, she whispered, her voice breaking into a pathetic squeak. You are transferring me to Cleveland. Aegis Financial has a massive high-volume data entry processing center in Ohio. I corrected her smoothly, sipping my wine. It is a windowless, high-security facility where you will input alphanumeric tax codes for 9 hours a day. The cost of living in that specific sector of Ohio is significantly lower, which is absolutely necessary since your wages are heavily garnished to pay for Malik's federal legal fees and your outstanding criminal restitution. The corporate housing provided is a small furnished studio apartment near the interstate highway. You report to your new regional floor manager on Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Do not be late. He is not nearly as forgiving as I am. Brittany dropped the paper onto the mahogany table. She looked at me, her eyes begging for a reprieve, searching for the sisterly bond she had spent 30 years actively destroying. I cannot live in Ohio, she choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. I do not know a single person there. I have absolutely nothing there. You have a job, I replied coldly, meeting her desperate gaze without a shred of empathy. Which is far more than you deserve after actively participating in the embezzlement that nearly bankrupted this entire family. You are lucky I did not hand your financial records directly to the federal prosecutors. Patricia began to weep quietly, her face buried in her trembling hands, her perfect manicure digging into her scalp. Richard just stared blankly at the employment contract. The reality of a mechanical time clock, a bright orange safety vest, and mandatory overtime stretching out before him for the rest of his natural life was finally sinking in. He looked up at me, his former arrogance completely extinguished, replaced by the hollow gaze of a thoroughly beaten man. We have absolutely no other choice, do we? He asked, his voice rough and defeated. No, I confirmed, my tone flat and uncompromising. You are entirely bankrupt. Your assets have been legally seized. Your social circle has completely abandoned you. The people who just ate dessert in this room will never return your phone calls again. If you walk out of this house without signing those exact contracts, you will be sleeping on the concrete pavement by midnight. Choose wisely. Richard picked up the sleek silver pen resting beside his dessert plate. His hand shook violently, the metal rattling against the table as he signed his name on the dotted line. He traded his legacy for a warehouse job. He handed the pen to Patricia, who signed through her blinding tears without even bothering to read the strict terms and conditions. Brittany followed suit, her signature barely legible, her spirit completely broken. They surrendered. They traded their immense pride for basic survival. They must literally clock in and work for the daughter they deemed worthless just to keep a roof over their heads. They had no choice but to accept their new reality. The next morning arrived crisp, cold, and blindingly clear. I stood on the sprawling front porch of my newly reclaimed estate, wearing a tailored cashmere coat against the biting autumn air. A single battered rented moving truck idled loudly in the circular stone driveway. My elite security team stood nearby with their arms crossed, strictly supervising as Richard and Patricia loaded the absolute last of their meager allowed belongings. They were permitted only their personal clothing and basic daily necessities. Everything else, the expensive art, the antique silver, the luxury imported vehicles, the designer furniture officially belonged to my holding company. I watched with quiet satisfaction as Richard struggled to lift a heavy cardboard box, his face red and straining with exertion. He looked entirely aged. Patricia stood shivering by the back of the truck wearing a plain wool coat, looking absolutely ordinary. Brittany was already gone. She had boarded a cheap, discounted commercial flight to Ohio long before sunrise, carrying only 2 suitcases to her new, windowless existence. The heavy steel doors of the moving truck slammed shut with a resounding metallic crash. Richard and Patricia climbed slowly into the cab of the moving van. They did not look back at the grand mansion they once ruled with absolute authority. They did not look at me standing victorious on the marble steps. The truck rumbled down the long tree-lined driveway, kicking up dead dry leaves as it turned onto the main highway and disappeared from sight forever. The autumn air was perfectly still. The toxic, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my shoulders for my entire life lifted entirely. I turned away from the empty driveway and walked gracefully down the steps toward my waiting chauffeur-driven luxury car. The driver quickly opened the heavy rear door. I slid into the plush, pristine leather seat. As the car pulled away from the estate, heading back toward the heart of the city, I watched the brilliant, shimmering skyline reflect clearly in the tinted glass of my window. I was entirely in control. I had won. Family isn't about blood, it's about respect. If they build a cage for you, buy the building and evict them. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family to build your own empire? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of taking back your power. The most profound lesson from this story is that biological ties never excuse toxic behavior. For years, the protagonist endured relentless emotional abuse and exploitation under the guise of family loyalty. However, her ultimate victory was not just about reclaiming her stolen wealth or orchestrating a dramatic downfall for her abusers. It was about reclaiming her personal power. She taught us that true family is built on mutual respect, not obligatory suffering. Walking away from those who continuously diminish your light is a necessary step toward peace. Have you ever escaped a toxic relative to protect your peace? Comment below.